Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just been born into the most powerful job on Earth, and you're already failing at it. While other newborns are allowed to cry, burp, and make a mess of things, you're being swaddled in ceremonial linen, inspected by priests, and declared the physical embodiment of Horus, god of kingship. You're not just a baby, you're a political event. Your birth is accompanied by omens. Stars are observed. Sacred cows may or may not moo in your honor. Somewhere, a man with a shaved head and too much eyeliner is already carving your name into a stone tablet you'll never read. From your first breath, everyone around you is panicking. Not because you're fragile, but because you're the next living god. Which means if you cough so much as cough, the court astrologer might declare a national crisis. Childhood not happening. You don't get toys. You get ceremonial scepters you're not allowed to chew on. You don't get lullabies. You get hymns written in your honor and chanted by elderly priests who smell like frankincense and regret. Your crib is likely a gold-plated structure that's colder than the Nile in February. You are surrounded by a team of caretakers whose job is to prevent you from dying, disappointing the gods, or doing anything undignified like crawling. You are bottle-fed political expectations. Your first words are probably scripted, and if you try to play with your cousin, someone whispers he's fourth in line. Best keep an eye on him. Even before you can walk, you're being groomed to rule. Royal advisors are already plotting your education, your image, and probably your eventual spouse who, spoiler alert, will share your last name and your jawline. And let's not forget you're being raised to believe you are divine. That's not a metaphor. You are expected to internalize from a young age that the sun rises for you, which is adorable until you realize the entire kingdom will blame you if it doesn't. If you thought being born a living god came with perks like skipping school or spending your mornings feeding ducks by the Nile, think again. As a young pharaoh in training, your schedule makes modern CEOs look underemployed. Your day starts early, like stars still out, priests already chanting. Early you're woken not by a gentle nanny, but by a steward holding a golden tablet detailing today's responsibilities. And no, taking a nap isn't on it. First lesson, reading and writing hieroglyphs. These are not normal letters. They're tiny pictures of birds, eyes, and upside-down bread loaves that somehow form entire government policies. One wrong doodle, and you've accidentally sentenced someone to eternal torment. Then there's religious instruction. You're quizzed on the sacred names of gods, the proper way to bless a cucumber, and how many times to blink during an offering. If you mess up, a priest frowns at you like you just sneezed on Ra himself. You also study math, not to do taxes, but to build monuments. You're taught geometry not for fun, but because one day someone will ask you how to stack 2.3 million limestone blocks into a perfect triangle without accidentally inventing a leaning pyramid. Oh, and don't forget public speaking. You'll have to give speeches to crowds that think you control the weather. There's no winging it when your words might be interpreted as divine instruction. Say the wrong thing and suddenly grain prices crash. Military strategy is next. You're 10. You've never even thrown a rock in anger, but now you're expected to know battlefield formations, river crossing techniques, and how to casually mention smite the Nubians in conversation. Philosophy. You don't get that. Instead, you're taught how to maintain Mach, the sacred cosmic balance, which sounds poetic until you realize it means making sure crops grow, criminals don't rebel, and nobody insults the gods during flood season. All of this happens under the watchful eyes of tutors who are equal parts teachers, informants, and walking anxiety attacks. By the end of the day, your head is full of symbols, schedules, sacred laws, and just enough political paranoia to keep you up at night. In most childhoods, your friends are the kids who share snacks, toys, and a mutual desire to avoid homework. But when you're the future pharaoh, your friends are more like potential enemies wrapped in linen tunics. Every child you interact with is a political variable, that cheerful boy who races you through the palace gardens. He's the high priest's son, the one who always wins at board games, nephew of a general, and the girl you actually like talking to, already betrothed to your cousin for dynastic stability. You're not surrounded by friends. You're surrounded by people with titles, bloodlines, and very nervous-looking parents. Everyone plays nice, but only because you're considered sacred and their careers depend on your favor. That's not friendship. That's networking. Even your tutors report back on your behavior. Did you show signs of independence? Excellent and also threatening. Did you question the rituals? Not excellent and possibly heretical. Did you ask if your cousin could stop staring at you during lunch? Alarming and definitely going on the scroll. Privacy doesn't exist. You can't sneak away for fun because fun is suspicious. If you disappear for 10 minutes, someone alerts the palace guard. You're divine, after all, and the divine must not wander off unattended like a common farmer's goat. Heaven help you if you show favoritism. Invite one child to place a net, and 3 others write angry letters and pictograms. Say something kind to a noble's daughter, and suddenly there's a rumor you've chosen your queen at age 9. So what do you become guarded, polite, politically neutral? You master the art of laughing without meaning it and complimenting tunics you secretly hate. You learn to make every friendship seem equal, because if someone feels slighted, their family might conspire against you during breakfast. This is the royal version of no new friends, not because you don't want them, but because any one of them might grow up to be your assassin, your rival, or worse, your brother-in-law. By now, you're not just a prince. You are officially divine. Not royalty divine, actual God on earth divine. The priests confirm it, the scrolls say it, and the people bow like you personally invented sunlight, which sounds impressive until you realize nobody asked if you were ready for that kind of pressure. Every time you sneeze, someone declares it a message from the heavens. Every step you take is ritualized, and every mistake you make must be carefully explained, in a way that doesn't imply the gods are clumsy or forgetful. But here's the kicker. While everyone calls you Horus on Earth, you still stub your toe, still get pimples, and still get stomach aches from too many figs. Divine, maybe, but not immune to bad digestion. The contradiction is staggering. You're taught you're all-powerful, yet you can't leave the palace without 5 guards, 3 priests, and a chariot procession. You supposedly control the floods of the Nile, but if you trip over a cat, someone starts whispering about bad omens. You're also expected to maintain Ma'at, the divine balance of the cosmos. It sounds poetic until you realize it means you're personally blamed if there's a drought, a riot, or a mildly disappointing harvest. And of course, there are rituals, constant, exhausting rituals. You must speak in special divine phrases. You eat sanctified food. You participate in ceremonies where you have to pretend to defeat evil using props and heavy golden objects while sweating in a linen tunic. Privately, you might feel doubt, maybe even boredom. But you can't say that because saying I'm not sure I'm a god is the fastest way to cause a theological meltdown or get replaced by a cousin who is sure. So you smile. You bless statues, you wave from balconies, and you quietly wonder how many gods before you also secretly hated this job. Because here's the truth. Being a god wasn't liberating. It was a full-time performance with eternal consequences. You were expected to be perfect, mystical, and celestial, even on days when all you really wanted was to eat a pomegranate in peace. And no one warns you that the higher they place you, the lonelier it gets at the top of Mount Divine Expectation. So puberty has arrived, your voice cracks, your body's changing, and just when things couldn't get more awkward, your advisors slide in with a scroll and a smile, announcing it's time to choose a wife, preferably your sister. Yes, your sister in the noble tradition of keeping the bloodline pure, a term that here means genetically risky. You're now expected to marry a close relative. Your aunt, your half-sister, your cousin. All perfectly acceptable options according to dynastic politics and zero genetic counselors. Romance, irrelevant. Personal preference, not part of the ceremony. This is about optics. You're divine. She's divine. And nothing screams divine legitimacy like holding hands at your wedding with someone who also shared your wet nurse. Meanwhile, the palace is buzzing. Court officials are debating which relative is the least related, like it's a riddle from the gods. The priests are thrilled. The bloodline stays heavenly. The servants are placing bets. You're just trying to pretend this is normal. But it gets better because it's not just about marriage, it's about heirs. Fest. You're barely past your first chin hair, and already there's pressure to produce a mini pharaoh to keep the line going. No pressure, kid. Just all of Egypt counting on your awkward teenage hormones. And while all this is happening, you're expected to remain calm, composed, and ceremonial because you're not just a husband. You're a symbol of order, fertility, and divine cosmic power, especially during rituals where you're paraded with your new bride, who, to remind you again, may also be your niece. In private, you might feel disgust, confusion, or just the overwhelming need to flee into the desert and scream into a sand dune. But expressing that would make you look unstable. So instead you nod, you smile, you attend the banquet, you marry your sister, and you convince yourself that it's for the good of the realm. Because what's a little inbreeding when the fate of Egypt depends on you producing a suitably godlike heir who may or may not have 3 elbows. This is royal puberty, sponsored by genetics, politics, and denial. And the only thing more twisted than the family tree is pretending it's all completely divine. You've finally been crowned pharaoh. Time to enjoy the glory, right? Not quite. First, they glue a fake beard to your chin with beeswax and strap a cobra to your forehead. Congratulations. You now look like a very anxious statue with back pain. Let's talk about the crown. It's not a nice, lightweight royal accessory. It's a solid, often dual-layered headpiece made of leather, linen, and sometimes actual metal. You're wearing symbolism, heavy, sweaty symbolism, and you have to stand for hours while wearing it in the sun, while priests chant things in your ear about the universe depending on your posture. The double crown is the real star here. It combines the red crown of Lower Egypt with the white crown of Upper Egypt, signifying that you rule everything, which is beautiful in theory and terrible for your neck. It feels like balancing 2 helmets and a houseplant on your skull. Then come the ceremonial outfits, long white kilts, leopard skin sashes, golden breastplates, all made to impress the gods and overwhelm your joints. Linen clings in all the wrong places. Gold doesn't breathe, and you're not allowed to fidget even if a bug crawls up your shin. And sandals? Forget comfort. They're decorative. They're basically papyrus flip-flops that offer no arch support and remind you constantly that style in ancient Egypt came before circulation. But none of this is optional. You must look divine, not comfortable on a chariot divine, sculpted into eternal godhood divine. Even if you're sweating buckets, chafing in gold, and desperately trying not to faint into the Nile, every outfit you wear, every color you choose, every feather sticking awkwardly from your headdress has cosmic implications. The wrong symbol could offend a god. The wrong color could signal political instability. The wrong hemline could accidentally summon a famine. No pressure. You are now part of a centuries-old-fashioned statement made for the gods, not for flexibility or airflow. And the only thing more exhausting than ruling Egypt is doing it while wearing 30 pounds of spiritual pageantry and pretending none of it itches. Your throne may be made of gold, but it's not ergonomic. And the only thing heavier than a crown on your head is the expectation that you wear it like you enjoy it. Being pharaoh came with unlimited power and unlimited blame. You were worshipped as a living god, sure. But the moment something went wrong, the entire kingdom looked straight at you, like you'd personally unplugged the Nile. Too much rain. Clearly, Pharaoh is unbalanced. Not enough rain. The gods must be punishing Pharaoh. Crops failing. That's your fault, too. And if someone stubbed their toe on a temple step, well, that's probably because you angered Batet by sneezing the wrong way during last week's ritual. You were the head of state, head of religion, and head of cosmic maintenance. If the sun didn't rise properly, people wouldn't assume bad weather. They assumed you forgot to pray hard enough. You had one job: keep the universe running smoothly. You also had no idea how to actually do that. And because of your divine status, you couldn't admit ignorance. I don't know why the plague of frogs wasn't a valid response. You had to either pretend you had a plan or make up a ritual on the spot and act like you meant to do it all along. Even your dreams were public property. If you had a bad dream, your court astrologers would gather, scribble furiously, and probably declare that a new temple needed to be built immediately to protect Egypt from your subconscious. Got a headache? That's a national omen. Woke up late? An official scribe notes it down as a possible sign of apocalyptic imbalance. One sneeze too many, and a goat gets sacrificed just to be safe. And if things really went downhill, famine, uprising, plague, sandstorm, crocodile incident, the people didn't say, "Wow, nature is wild." They said Pharaoh must be weak or worse. Maybe the gods want a new Pharaoh. So you walk around draped in gold, surrounded by incense and flanked by bodyguards, all while quietly wondering if your citizens are building a new statue or digging a new tomb. The role of Pharaoh wasn't just ruling the land. It was absorbing the blame for every mosquito bite, muddy riverbank, or undercooked sacrificial goose. Because when you're divine, there's no such thing as a simple mistake. It was never just your job to lead. It was your job to be perfect and take the fall when the universe hiccuped. Being Pharaoh meant early mornings. Your wake-up call wasn't gentle. It involved ritual chants, burning incense, and a group of heavily perfumed priests quietly judging your posture. A normal person might start their day with coffee. You start by being ritually purified with water from a sacred pool that's probably colder than the afterlife. Then it's straight into the wardrobe. Not for fun, but because your linen had to be blessed, pre-folded, and lightly ironed with moonlight. Or something equally dramatic. You're barely awake, but you're already wearing 30 layers and a chest plate shaped like a falcon. Next, the ritual cycle begins. You enter the temple. A priest unrolls a scroll the length of a crocodile. You're expected to perform sacred gestures in perfect sequence. Hand here, nod there, smirk at the statue. Chant the name of a god you haven't studied since childhood. Forget making a mistake, one wrong syllable, and suddenly you're being blamed for the Nile drying up, the cattle dying, or the moon not looking divine enough. Everything had to be done perfectly to maintain Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe, which for some reason was apparently hanging on your ability to wave incense correctly. The rituals weren't short either. Some ceremonies took hours, and you couldn't yawn. You couldn't slouch. You definitely couldn't say, "Hey, do we really need to rub sacred oil on all 43 statues today?" This wasn't just religious duty. It was the national theater. Priests performed, scribes recorded, onlookers nodded in grim spiritual approval. Meanwhile, you stood in stiff silence, pretending you didn't have a cramp in your god leg. And all this happened before you did anything resembling ruling the kingdom. So yes, you were the most powerful person in Egypt. But your mornings were dictated by astrology, bird omens, and a ceremonial checklist that made modern tax forms look fun. By the time the sun actually rose, you were already exhausted and still had 12 more rituals, 3 public appearances, and 1 carefully scripted divine smile to go as Pharaoh. You were the most powerful figure in the kingdom, and that meant every single person around you was either pretending to love you or calculating how to replace you. Your guards? Loyal, yes, until someone offered them enough gold, goats, or spiritual favors. Your advisors? Always smiling, always nodding, always accidentally reminding you that your cousin is very popular with the military. Even your cupbearer was suspiciously enthusiastic about bringing you drinks, like he wanted you to notice how not poisoned they were. And let's not forget your extended royal family, a tangled mess of half-brothers, uncles, and people named Ramesses who definitely wanted your sandals. These weren't relatives. These were succession applicants. Every hallway conversation could be an ambush, every banquet a potential Last Supper. You couldn't relax in your own palace without wondering if the decorative cobra on your chair was decorative enough. The paranoia was justified. Assassinations were practically an Egyptian sport. If you died suddenly, it was often described as a divine mystery, which really meant someone got creative with date wine and scorpion venom. So you develop habits. You had food tasters. You rotated servants. You changed your daily routine at random. Not because it helped, but because at least it made betrayal slightly inconvenient. And sleep. Good luck. You rested in a guarded room with triple locked doors, a ceremonial dagger under your pillow, and a guard you only half trusted standing at the entrance practicing his best. I didn't do it face to face. But the most exhausting part wasn't avoiding death. It was pretending you didn't know it was coming. You had to stay calm, divine, and bothered because showing fear meant weakness and weakness meant opportunity. Every glance, every handshake, every well-timed compliment could be part of someone's rise to your throne. And if you made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, well, you wouldn't have to worry about politics anymore. Being Pharaoh wasn't about ruling. It was about surviving in a palace full of people who bowed during the day and sharpened knives at night. As Pharaoh, you were expected to be many things: divine, wise, unshakably composed, and incredibly photogenic in 40-degree heat while wearing a gold chest plate and a smile that didn't suggest imminent collapse. Egyptian public life was built around ceremony, long, elaborate processions through streets packed with people who loved you, feared you, or just came for the free bread. You stood in chariots waving like a deity on parade while secretly wondering if passing out was considered a bad omen. The outfits didn't help. You were decked out in elaborate robes, glinting jewelry, symbolic scepters, and a ceremonial headdress that trapped heat like a portable oven. Your linen stuck to places linen should never touch, and your sandals squished like they were stuffed with soggy papyrus. And through hours of rituals, blessing sacred cows, cutting ceremonial ribbons with a gold knife, naturally, and accepting offerings you didn't want from nobles you didn't trust, you smiled, nodded, and occasionally muttered, "May the gods bless you," while quietly dying inside the sun. It didn't care that you were a god. It beat down like a divine judgment. Your makeup ran. Your incense choked you. And yet every eye in the crowd was watching, expecting to see perfection, not heat stroke in a leopard skin sash. And if you did falter, if you looked tired or annoyed or, gods forbid, slightly human, the rumors would start. Pharaoh is displeased. Pharaoh is weak. The heavens are shaking. You miss one ceremonial goose blessing, and suddenly people are whispering about drought, even the festivals, which sounds like fun, but it was just more work. You had to attend banquets where you couldn't eat, dances where you couldn't move, and religious plays where you played yourself and still didn't get a speaking part. It wasn't a celebration, it was theater, and you were the main actor every single time. At the end of the day, you limped back to the palace, drenched in sweat and divinity, wondering how many more statues you had to bless before the gods finally granted you a nap. Being Pharaoh in public meant constantly pretending you were having a spiritually profound time, while slowly roasting like a ceremonial duck on display. On the surface, you were Pharaoh, Horus on earth, Lord of the two lands, divine ruler of all things Nihil adjacent. But behind that glittering facade stood an even more powerful force: priests. You see, the temples weren't just for prey. They were banks, farms, schools, libraries, tax offices, and, in all likelihood, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of data centers. The priesthood controlled grain, land, gold, public opinion, and metaphysical guild, which meant that while you wore the crown, they held the ledgers. Every temple was a kingdom within your kingdom, and its high priest was its seal. These weren't harmless old men humming hymns. They were political tacticians in robes, fluent in astrology, bookkeeping, and subtle blackmail. They managed the gods, the festivals, the omens, and more importantly, your public image. If you sneezed on a feast day, they could interpret it as divine disapproval. If you wore the wrong color sash, that might mean RA was sad and suddenly the Bali riot started. And yet you had to work with them without the priests. Your divinity could vanish overnight. All it took was one new prophecy carved into a temple wall and proof the gods have chosen another. Worse, the temples were tax exempt. They hoarded wealth with holy immunity. Meanwhile, your treasuries struggled to stay full unless you started a war, sold grain, or shook down a merchant caravan. The priests. They had golden statues of jackals with better retirement plans than your military generals. But the worst part, they pretended to serve you. Pharaoh, we live only to uphold your divine will, they'd say, while quietly diverting resources, managing spies, and advising your enemies to try prayer and also treason. You were the figurehead, the sunlit symbol, the living god, and they were the committee that decided how godly you were allowed to be this week. Mess with the temples and the nation rebels. Obey the temples, and you slowly become their mascot. It was a power struggle with incense and passive aggression, and the longer you reigned, the more you realized the gods might live in the heavens, but their accountants definitely lived at Karnak. In most families, drama means someone forgot a birthday or made a snide comment at dinner. In yours, it meant conspiracy, palace coups, and the occasional accidental crocodile pit incident. Because as pharaoh, your biggest threat wasn't some foreign army. It was your own bloodline. You were raised in a palace full of siblings, cousins, uncles, and half-uncles who all believed they should be sitting on your throne. Some were ambitious, some were delusional. All of them were dangerous. Succession. That was a nightmare. Egypt didn't have a firstborn to rule everything. It was more like whoever survives the most assassination attempts and secures priestly approval wins. Half the court spent their time trying to guess which of your sons might become the next pharaoh, and the other half tried to make sure it wasn't the wrong one. Your own children were groomed like race horses. Each had factions, tutors, spies, and mothers whispering bedtime stories about how the gods always choose the most handsome heir. Subtle, meanwhile. Your brothers and uncles weren't content with being royal background characters. Every one of them had at least one general on speed dial and a disturbing familiarity with accidental staircase tumbles. And of course, there were the queens. Yes, plural. You had multiple wives, often all living under the same roof, forming alliances and rivalries with the precision of political chess masters. One wrong glance at the wrong royal woman, and suddenly the kitchen staff is quietly replacing your wine taster. Palace life was like living in a really beautiful, overly perfumed cage where everyone was either your relative or your future usurper. And funerals. Oh, the drama. Every death became a suspicious death. Every illness, potential poisoning. Every coughing fit, a topic of temple gossip. Even your own burial wasn't safe. Tombs were looted. Names were erased. And your own loyal son might finish your pyramid and then immediately start carving over your legacy because he wanted a bigger one. Being pharaoh meant that the people who knew you best were also the people who most wanted you removed politely, permanently. It was a royal forest full of snakes. So after a life of rituals, paranoia, heat stroke, and family backstabbing, you finally die. You think you'd earned a break. But no, in Egypt, being dead didn't mean being done. It just meant you were about to become a full-time spiritual symbol and a part-time horror movie prop. The embalming process begins immediately. Your internal organs are removed, weighed, and politely stuffed into canopic jars, each one guarded by a funereal animal-headed deity, like a post-mortem Pokemon team. Your brain pulled out through your nose with a hook. Not because it's useless, but because tradition says so. Then you're stuffed with resin-soaked linens and natron salts until you resemble a sacred raisin in a very fancy bandage. Your body becomes a political relic wrapped tighter than your palace tax scrolls. Next comes the coffin, or rather coffins, plural. You're stuffed into a series of increasingly ornate wooden boxes, like some kind of divine nesting doll, each covered in gold leaf inscriptions and protective spells in case you encounter rude ghosts on your way to the afterlife. But the real showstopper, the tomb. You spent half your life and half the kingdom's GDP, constructing a mausoleum designed to scream immortality, walls covered in instructions, prayers, and awkwardly drawn images of you smiting enemies who definitely aren't going to bother you in the afterlife. Unfortunately, your tomb also screams, "Please rob me." Despite curses, guards, and architectural misdirection, most pharaohs' tombs were looted within decades, sometimes hours, of being sealed. So while your priests were chanting prayers over your eternal spirit, local criminals were sprinting off with your gold-plated footrest. But the worst part? If your name is forgotten, if your tomb is defaced, or if your mummified body ends up in a museum gift shop 3,000 years later, you don't get to enjoy the afterlife at all. That's right, one bureaucratic oversight, and you're stuck haunting some poor archaeologist forever. You might have been king in life, but in death, you're museum bait, political currency, or a cautionary tale carved into limestone. And just think, you haven't even reached the judgment hall yet. For someone marketed as a divine being, you sure spent a lot of time in mortal danger. Being pharaoh wasn't just about building temples and posing for statues. No, it also meant leading armies personally, as in grab your war chariot, strap on a bronze sword, and go smite some foreigners before breakfast. Your generals made the plans. The scribes wrote the propaganda. But you had to show up and pretend you weren't terrified because divine authority only worked if people saw you physically leading the charge, even if you had absolutely no idea how to hold a spear without looking like you were trying to pick up laundry. And forget hiding in a tent like some medieval king. You were expected to ride at the front of the formation, waving a ceremonial axe and shouting your divine catchphrase, usually something like "the gods will crush you," while silently hoping the enemy didn't have better archers this year. Even if the battle went well, you couldn't win quietly. You had to return home with prisoners, loot, and enough severed hands to impress the temple accountants, all of which would be paraded through the streets while you smiled and tried to look both humble and terrifying. Lose the battle, though. That's a problem. Big one. Because pharaohs don't lose. If you get injured, humiliated, or, gods forbid, run away, the priests might interpret it as divine displeasure, or worse, an excuse to replace you with someone who hasn't been cursed by defeat. So now you're stuck in a cycle. Raise taxes to fund a war. Fight the war to protect your image. Then build a monument to exaggerate the war in case people noticed you nearly died. It's expensive, exhausting, and extremely bad for your blood pressure. And here's the kicker. Even if you didn't want to fight, you often had no choice. Generals demanded it. Advisors insisted the gods sent a dream. Or maybe the priests just ran out of things to do and decided it was smiting season again. You weren't just pharaoh. You were the marketing department for national military ambition. And if you didn't win, you'd better hope they'd bury you fast. Because history isn't kind to divine war heroes who come home without trophies. After all the rituals, warfare, backstabbing siblings, and linen-wrapped paranoia, you think history would at least give you a standing ovation. But no, the final insult of being pharaoh was this. Your legacy was entirely out of your hands. You could commission the grandest temple, carve your name on every obelisk, and bury yourself beneath a mountain of gold. But all it took was one jealous successor with a chisel, and poof, you never existed. Name erased, statues defaced. Achievements reassigned to your great-nephew who ruled for 6 minutes and declared himself son of the sun and also super cool. Erasing names wasn't just pettiness, it was spiritual murder. In ancient Egypt, if no one spoke your name, your soul couldn't reach the afterlife, which means you weren't just forgotten. You were trapped in cosmic limbo because your great-grandson wanted your pyramid budget. And even if they didn't erase you, they might just rewrite you. Suddenly, your disastrous battle becomes a glorious victory. Your mild-mannered personality upgraded to unquestionably heroic. That embarrassing crocodile incident was omitted entirely. Future generations treated your legacy like a group project they didn't read the notes for. You were remembered not as who you were, but what made the next guy look better. And for some pharaohs, the real humiliation came thousands of years later, when their carefully guarded tombs were discovered by archaeologists who immediately cracked them open, put their mummies under fluorescent lighting, and shipped their fingernails to museums. That gold sarcophagus you spend your life preparing? It's now a display case for elementary school field trips. Your royal toenail clippings are tagged, cataloged, and possibly available in a gift shop as keychains. You ruled empires, you were a god, and now you're a skeleton in a climate control box while tourists mispronounce your name and wonder if your curses are still active. So yes, you were the living embodiment of divine order, the chosen of Ra, the Lord of the Two Lands, and your greatest reward being slightly misrepresented by a travel blogger 3,000 years later. Harold Sigurdsson entered the world in the year 1015, screaming, we assume, into a kingdom already on fire. Norway was a battleground. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was fighting tooth and axe to unify the country under one crown. It wasn't going well. The nobles hated Olaf, the Danes wanted his head, and the old pagan traditions were cracking under the weight of Christian kingship. So baby Harold was born not into a cradle of comfort, but into a world of sword points, shifting alliances and blood feuds. His family wasn't ordinary either. His father, Sigurd Syr, was a minor king, more farmer than warrior, but wealthy and respected. His mother, Oster Gudbrandsdata, was the political firestarter of the family, ambitious, shrewd, and fiercely Christian. And most importantly, she was the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, soon to be St. Olaf. That made Harold a prince by blood and destiny, and younger brother who would grow up watching a warrior king try to claw a country into unity. From the beginning, Harold wasn't treated like a child who might one day do something important. He was trained like a future chess piece in a game that was already bloody. By age 10, he could handle a sword. By 11, he knew how to ride, and by 15, he was riding into battle. Yes, 15. That was the year Olaf lost his throne to Danish invaders and returned from exile in 1030 to reclaim it. He gathered a ragged army of loyalists and marched to his doom at the Battle of Stiklestad. And guess who rode with him? Harold. Just 15 years old, Harold rode beside his legendary brother into the teeth of a superior army. No war paint, no glorious armor, just a teenager in chainmail. With too much idealism and not enough fear, the battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed. Harold, wounded and probably in shock, was forced to flee into the mountains with the scraps of the army. And from that moment on, Harold would never be a child again. He would be a fugitive, a survivor, and a man shaped by defeat. The Viking prince had entered the stage, not in glory, but in blood and retreat. This was not the end of Harold's story. It was just the prologue. After Stiklestad, Harold didn't disappear. He retreated. Wounded and grieving, he fled eastward, crossing the snowy spine of Scandinavia into the wide rivers and dark forests of Kievan Rus. To most Norwegians, that meant exile, but to Harold, it was a second chance. At the time, Kievan Rus was a rising powerhouse. Slavic, Norse, Byzantine-influenced, and ruled by Yaroslav the Wise. Lucky for Harold, Yaroslav had a soft spot for well-connected Viking royalty. Even luckier, Yaroslav's court was already crawling with Norse mercenaries. Harold fit right in, but this wasn't some cushy guest spot in a royal palace. Harold signed up to fight, and fight he did against raiders, steppe nomads, rebellious princes. Harold earned his scars and his silver. He impressed Yaroslav so much that he was given command of troops barely a year after arriving. He also may have fallen in love with one of Yaroslav's daughters, but we'll get back to that. The young Viking's reputation grew. He was tall, fierce, and clever with tactics. While most warriors charged headlong into battle, Harold flanked, feinted, and waited for his moment to strike. If you were under his command, you learned discipline. If you faced him, you learned regret. By now, Harold had matured into something far more dangerous than a desperate teenage prince. He was an operator, a warlord in exile, with no throne, no homeland, and no master. But Rus's wasn't where Harold planned to end his days. It was a forge shaping the iron. He wanted more. And so in the late 1030s, Harold turned his gaze southward to Constantinople. It was the richest city on earth, guarded by walls taller than most mountains back home and filled with gold, politics, and endless war. The Byzantine emperor needed soldiers. Harold needed a kingdom. A deal was waiting. So he left Yaroslav's court and traveled to the city the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. He wasn't going as a pilgrim. He was going to join the most elite mercenary unit of the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. This wasn't just a career move. It was an invasion of the Byzantine Empire from the inside, and Harold was about to become one of the most feared swords in their arsenal when Harold reached Constantinople in the early 1040s. He entered a world that made even the wealthiest Viking jarls look like peasants. The great city gleamed with domes, mosaics, silver, and secrets. This was the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, and Harold wanted a piece of it. He joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit made up mostly of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries. Their job? Guard the emperor, fight his wars, and keep a very sharp axe handy in case things got political. Harold wasn't just another brute with a beard. He rose fast. His height, his cunning, and the sheer ferocity of his fighting style turned heads. He didn't just survive in Byzantium, he thrived. Over the next few years, Harold Hardrada became a living storm. He fought in Sicily against Arab rebels. He battled pirates in the Aegean. He marched through Anatolia, crossed into the Holy Land, and even reached as far as Jerusalem, where, legend says, he bathed in the River Jordan and made a vow to someday rule a kingdom of his own. But Harold wasn't just swinging a sword. He was watching, learning, and plotting. Byzantine politics were a viper pit, courtiers, generals, and eunuchs all stabbing each other in the back with a smile. And while Harold couldn't out-scheme the palace elite, he could outlast them. He was there during multiple emperor swaps, civil unrest, and shady palace coups, and through it all, he kept rising. He also got very, very rich. Spoils of war, bribes, gifts. Some say he even stashed treasure in Constantinople to collect later. He wore silk, not fur, gold, not bronze. This wasn't the Viking boy who fled Stiklestad. This was a seasoned warrior with more Byzantine polish than most Greek courtiers. But Harold was never going to be content guarding someone else's throne. And when the emperor began to see him as a threat, just another ambitious foreigner with too much gold and too many friends, Harold decided it was time to leave. He escaped Byzantium the way he'd survived everything else, with a combination of nerve, muscle, and sheer Viking stubbornness. He'd spent nearly a decade fighting for emperors. Now he would fight for himself. His next stop? Home, Norway. And this time he wasn't coming back to beg. He was coming back to rule. By 1045, Harald Hardrada was done being anyone's hired sword. He returned to Scandinavia, a battle-hardened warlord, glittering with Byzantine gold, trailing exotic mercenaries, and carrying enough battlefield experience to make most kings look like amateurs. But Norway wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. At the time, Norway already had a king, Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harald's half-brother Stig. Magnus had been holding the throne reasonably well. He was young, popular, and he united both Norway and Denmark under his rule. But what he didn't have was Harald's experience, Harald's wealth, or Harald's ambition. So Harald did what any self-respecting Viking power player would do. He hired an army. Using his Byzantine treasure hoard, Harald recruited fighters from across Russes and Sweden. Then he struck a deal. With Svein Estridsson, Magnus' rival in Denmark, Harald would help Svein reclaim Denmark, and in return Svein would help Harald challenge Magnus for Norway. It was a messy medieval bromance based entirely on mutual hatred and longboats, but Harald didn't actually need to invade. Magnus, sensing a bloody civil war in the making, made a surprising move. He offered to share the throne with Harald. It was a power-sharing deal that was never meant to last. The two co-ruled Norway with all the tension of a forced marriage between a peaceable king and a returning war machine. It was like trying to split a crown between a monk and a lion. And Harald wasn't the monk. In 1047, just 2 years into their uneasy arrangement, Magnus died suddenly. Some say illness, others whisper poison. Harald didn't waste time mourning. He seized the throne of Norway without blinking and made it crystal clear. He was now sole king, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted Denmark too, and so began nearly 2 decades of war between Harald and Svein Estridsson. Raids, battles, skirmishes. Harald hammered Danish coasts with the same energy he once brought to Arab fortresses. He burned towns, seized ships, and left no village unplundered. Yet he could never quite hold the land. Denmark resisted. Sven survived, and the throne remained out of reach. Still, Norway was his, and Harald ruled it like a man who had spent 20 years fighting for the right to wear a crown. But he hadn't forgotten about England, and soon his eyes turned west. By the late 1040s, Harald Hardrada sat on the throne of Norway, not just as a warlord turned king, but as the last true Viking monarch. He ruled with the discipline of Byzantium, the ferocity of Rus, and the ambition of a man who had never forgotten what it meant to lose. His rule was anything but gentle. Harald raised taxes, centralized power, and crushed dissent. Nobles who opposed him either bent the knee or vanished. He used his wealth to maintain a standing army and a fleet, an unheard of luxury for Norwegian kings of the time. He built churches, minted coins, and made it clear Norway wasn't some northern backwater anymore. It was a real kingdom with real teeth. But Harald's idea of kingship was medieval realpolitik. He wanted loyalty, but only after obedience. He wanted peace, but on his terms. If a local chieftain challenged him, Harald sent troops. If peasants protested taxes, they met swords. He wasn't a tyrant. He was just Viking royalty with imperial instincts, and the Norwegians, frankly, didn't know what hit them. Still, his reign wasn't all steel and fire. Harold was also a man of culture. He wrote poetry, often about himself naturally, and supported scolds who immortalized his deeds in verse. He maintained trade routes across Europe and even re-established contacts with the Byzantine court, just in case his treasure stash needed revisiting. He also never stopped warring with Denmark. Every summer, like clockwork, he'd launch a new raid, sailing down to Danish shores, torching villages, taunting Sven Stridsson like an annual reminder that he still had a score to settle. These campaigns were less about conquest now and more about pride. Harold couldn't let go, and Svein refused to die, but even Harold knew he was getting older. By the early 1060s, he started grooming his son, Olaf Kira, for the throne. He probably expected to rule a few more decades, retire into legend, maybe die in his sleep surrounded by gold and loyal warriors. But then came 1066, the year England exploded into chaos. Edward the Confessor had died without an heir. Competing claims flooded in, and Harold, gray at the temples but still sharp as a spear, saw his last great chance. He didn't just want Norway or Denmark anymore. He was coming for England. 1066 wasn't just a year. It was the year, the kind that turns a king into a legend or a corpse. And Harold Hardrada, nearing 50 but still built like a bear, was about to roll the dice one last time. Edward the Confessor, King of England, had died childless. The throne was up for grabs. Harold Godwin's son claimed it. William of Normandy prepared to invade. But then from the icy end came Harold. Because why not? He had a half-baked claim through an old deal with the Danish King Canute, who once ruled England. Did it make sense legally? Not really. But in Viking logic, a claim plus an army equals a throne. And Harold brought an army. He allied with Tostig Godwin's son, the bitter exiled brother of Harold, England's new king. Tostig promised English support. Harold promised steel. With around 300 longships and over 10,000 warriors, he sailed across the North Sea, just like Viking ancestors had done for centuries. Only this time it wasn't a raid. It was a full-scale invasion. In September 1066, he landed near the Humber and advanced toward York. The English weren't ready at the Battle of Fulford. Harold crushed a hastily assembled force under the northern earls. The gates of northern England opened. York surrendered. The old Viking magic was back. Harold was confident. This wasn't Byzantium's twisted politics or Denmark's stalemates. This was raw conquest. He set up camp at Stamford Bridge, demanding hostages from the region. And then, surprise, Harold Godwin's son, the English king, had forced march his army in from London in under a week. He arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, catching Harold's forces completely off guard. Many of Harold's men had left their armor behind, expecting negotiations, not a battle. What followed was brutal. The Vikings fought fiercely, but they were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, unprepared. One berserker reportedly held the bridge alone, buying time. But even Viking courage had its limits. In the melee, Harold took an arrow to the throat. The Viking Thunderhead fell in battle, swinging his sword until the very end. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and with Harold's death, the Viking age itself died with him. September 25, 1066, Harold Hardrada met his fate on a grassy field near Stamford Bridge, and with him died the last true Viking dream of conquest. It was supposed to be a negotiation day. Harold had left his chainmail behind, basking in the afterglow of victory at Fulford. His men were relaxing. The weather was mild. England looked ripe for the taking. Then came the dust cloud. Harold Godwin's son had pulled off one of the fastest troop movements in medieval history. He and his army had marched nearly 200 miles in under 4 days, and they didn't arrive quietly. The English caught the Norwegians totally unprepared, scattered, and mostly unarmored. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Still, the Vikings didn't roll over. They fought with the desperation of men who knew the North Sea was too far behind them. A single warrior blocked the narrow bridge with a massive axe, delaying the English advance and turning himself into instant legend. He allegedly killed over 40 men before being stabbed from beneath the bridge by a spear. That's how desperate things were. Kings were relying on bridge trolls to buy them time. Harold, once he realized what was happening, scrambled to form a shield wall. But it was chaotic. Men arrived in pairs without armor, rushing into formation as arrows rained down. Then the English cavalry slammed into their flanks. The shield wall held for a while. Harold himself fought like the berserker he was once trained to be. According to legend, he swung a massive two-handed sword with both hands, towering above his men like a war god. He killed, bled, and roared. Then came the arrows straight through the windpipe. The last great Viking king fell without a final word. When reinforcements from the ships finally arrived under Einstein Aura, Harold's standard-bearer, it was too late. They found the field littered with corpses. Eystein himself died in what became known as Ori's Storm, a doomed counterattack that ended in more Norse blood-soaking English soil. Out of Harold's massive fleet of 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The message was clear. The age of Viking conquest was over. The dragon ships would sail home, but their fire was gone. Harold Hardraller's death at Stamford Bridge didn't just end a campaign. It closed a chapter in world history. The Viking Age, that glorious, brutal, gold-hungry century of raids, sagas, and longships, had officially breathed its last. And fittingly, it died with a Viking king falling in battle far from home, sword in hand, lungs filling with blood. But the impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. In the days after the battle, Harold Godwin's son barely had time to breathe. As the Norwegians limped back to their ships, Harold received word that another invasion had landed in the south, William of Normandy. Had Harold not attacked when he did, Harold Godwin's son might have had more time to prepare. Instead, barely 3 weeks after crushing one invader, he had to face another. At Hastings, on October 14th, Harold fell to the Normans and England passed into new hands. So, in a strange twist of fate, Harold Hardrader, who failed to take the English crown, may have paved the way for William to do just that. The chaos Harold brought in weakened the kingdom just enough to crack open the door. Meanwhile, back in Norway, the news hit like a cold wave. The once invincible Harold, hero of Rus, scourge of Byzantium, ruler of a proud kingdom, was gone. His son, Olaf Kira, took the throne. But Olaf wasn't his father. He was a quieter ruler, more interested in peace than plunder. Under his reign, Norway stabilized. The old Viking fire cooled into politics, trade, and Christianity. The longships were still there, but they stopped being weapons and became tools of commerce. No more berserkers charging monasteries. No more gods demanding blood on the beaches. No more kings with their eyes fixed W, dreaming of silver and conquest. The sagas would still be sung, but the men who inspired them were now ghosts. Harold's life was the Viking world's last great epic. From snowy Norway to the golden domes of Constantinople, from steppe skirmishes to English meadows, he embodied everything the Viking Age stood for. Bravery, ambition, ruthlessness, and above all, motion. But after Stamford Bridge, that motion stopped, and the Norse world turned its gaze inward. The Viking Age had ended. The medieval world had begun. Harald Hardrada's death may have marked the end of the Viking Age, but his legacy was too large to be buried with him. Even centuries later, his story echoes through sagas, ballads, and history books like a battle horn across a fjord. He wasn't just a king. He was a symbol of a dying age, of Viking ambition at its wildest, and of what happens when a man refuses to fade quietly into history. Historians argue over how to define Harold. Was he a conqueror? A poet? A cold-blooded killer? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. He wrote verse, but also ordered raids that reduced villages to ash. He built churches in Norway, but also left fields soaked with blood from Sicily to Stamford Bridge. He was both brute and bard, builder and destroyer. But what no one questions is his greatness. No other Viking traveled as far, fought in as many wars, or accumulated as much wealth and renown as Harold. He served emperors, defied kings, and bent whole armies to his will. While most Norse leaders faded into legend with a few sagas and a cairn, Harold carved his name into 3 empires. His poetry survives. His name echoes in the Heimskringla and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and his exploits still challenge modern filmmakers, writers, and scholars to figure out how one man could pack 3 lifetimes into 50 years. Even the name Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, speaks volumes. It wasn't an insult. It was a warning. Harold didn't bend. He ruled as he fought with fire in his blood and a blade in his hand. After his death, Norway changed. Olaf Kira, his son, ushered in peace and prosperity. Trade blossomed. The sword was sheathed, and the Viking era turned into memory. But Harold remained larger than life. In Norway, he became a national icon. In Iceland, a saga subject. In England, a cautionary tale. And in Byzantium, a ghost of the north who once stood guard over emperors. He was the last Viking king, and he died as he lived with a sword in his hand, chasing a crown when a longship stopped sailing and the mead halls quieted. The world turned, but Harold Hardrada had already made sure it would remember his name. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just wood, nails, and sailcloth. It was identity, legacy, and destiny. It was how you traded, how you raided, how you traveled, and how you passed on. So when a chieftain or warrior died, burying them in a ship wasn't just ceremonial, it was essential in Viking belief. The ship was a sacred vessel that bridged the world of the living and the dead. Just as a warrior sailed across the sea in life to conquer foreign lands, they would now sail across the metaphysical sea to reach the afterlife. This wasn't a quaint superstition. It was a cosmic lore. Life was a voyage, and death was simply the next leg of the journey. That's why these ship burials were so elaborate. The ship itself had to be worthy. We're talking about long ships up to 70 feet long, carved with dragon-headed prows and built to cut through waves and apparently through spiritual dimensions. The body would be laid in the center, typically on a bed or pile of furs. Around it, the mourners would begin to fill the ship, not with tears, but with gear. Weapons, of course, a sword, axe, shield, and spear, because even the dead needed to be ready for battle in the afterlife. But also tools, clothing, jewelry, and occasionally more morbid cargo, slaves, horses, and even hawks sacrificed to serve the master in death as they had in life. To us, this sounds brutal. To the Vikings, it was an honor. The ship was then buried under tons of earth, creating a mound, a permanent marker of power. These weren't just tombs, they were statements. Here lies someone important enough to deserve a ship to the next world. And it wasn't just men. Some of the most magnificent ship burials, like the famous Oseberg burial, belonged to women. Viking queens, priestesses, and aristocrats were also sent into the soil with ships and riches, proving that spiritual passage wasn't just for the sword-swinging elite. So when we say Vikings lived and died by the sea, we mean it literally for them. The ship wasn't just how you conquered foreign lands, it was how you conquered death. If Viking ship burials sound like legend, the Oseberg and Gokstad discoveries turned legend into fact. These weren't dusty old grave pits. They were time capsules, fully intact ships pulled from beneath the Norwegian soil, packed with splendor, secrets, and the unmistakable smell of legacy. Let's start with the Oseberg ship, unearthed in 1904. When farmers started digging near a burial mound in southeastern Norway, they didn't expect to hit a 70-foot-long dragon ship. But there it was, immaculately preserved under the clay, almost untouched by time. The prow rose in a graceful serpentine curve, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The craftsmanship was staggering. This wasn't a warship. It was ceremonial, a royal hearse for someone exceptional. But here's the twist. The Oseberg burial held 2 women, one older, likely noble or royal, the other younger, possibly a servant or a high priestess. The older woman may have been a queen or a powerful Volve, Viking seeress. Her body was draped in silk and wool, surrounded by carved sledges, chests, buckets, animal remains, and even a cart with wheels as ornate as cathedral windows. 2 sacrificed oxen lay at the prow. This wasn't a quiet funeral, it was a cosmic launch party. Then there's the Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880 and far more battle-ready. Sleek, fast, and armed for war. Inside was the skeleton of a man in his 40s, likely a chieftain or warrior king. His identity remained a mystery, but he was buried with grandeur. Shields lined the sides of the ship, and beside him were beds, weapons, gaming pieces, and the remains of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and even 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks. These ship graves reveal more than wealth. They reveal beliefs. The Oseberg burials spoke of ritual and female power. The Gokstad ship hinted at prestige, conquest, and global trade. Together, they show how the Vikings tied death to travel, how the next world wasn't a place you waited for, but a destination you sailed to. These are no ordinary graves. These were declarations, echoes of power, floating temples buried in the earth. And they were just the beginning. A Viking funeral wasn't just a somber goodbye. It was a spectacle, a powerful theatrical rite of passage designed to launch the dead into the next world and make sure the living never forgot their name. And ship burials. They were the main event. It all began with a body. The deceased wasn't just placed on a pile of wood like an afterthought. Their bodies were washed, dressed in fine garments, silk if available, embroidered wool if not, and often adorned with jewelry or symbols of status. In some cases, they were even posed as if peacefully asleep, cradling weapons or seated upright in a ceremonial posture. Then came the rituals, and this is where things got a little bloodstained. Accounts like the one by Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan give chilling insight into Viking funeral rites, especially among the Rus and Norse group in Eastern Europe. In one account, when a chieftain died, a slave girl volunteered or was selected to join him in death. Over days, she was treated like royalty, washed, dressed, paraded. Then at the funeral, she was sacrificed, strangled and stabbed in a grisly ceremony involving chants, drums, and alcohol-fueled ecstasy. Animals weren't spared either. Horses were slaughtered to carry the soul dogs. Hawks and even cows were offered as companions or guardians. In rare cases, boats were surrounded by ringed stone circles believed to symbolize the boundary between worlds. As for the ship, it wasn't always buried intact. Sometimes it was burned, set ablaze, and pushed out to sea in a flaming farewell that lit the night sky. Other times it was placed in a dugout pit and covered in stones or earth to form a burial mound. The choice depended on status, location, and sometimes sheer practicality. Burning a longship wasn't cheap. These funerals weren't just religious, they were political. A massive burial was a public show of power. This was no ordinary man, the message went. This was someone whose death shook the earth and whose journey to the gods deserves thunder. The ship burials were violent, beautiful, and deeply spiritual. They weren't sending the dead away. They were launching them like stars into eternity. Thanks to Hollywood, most people picture a Viking funeral the same way. A blazing longship drifting out to sea, flames licking the sky while stoic warriors watch from the shore. It's cinematic. It's dramatic. It's also mostly fiction. So what's the truth? The reality is that ship burials, not burnings, were far more common in the archaeological record. Burial mounds like Oseberg, Gokstad, and Tun show long ships carefully placed in the ground, loaded with grave goods and covered with soil or stones. These weren't one-size-fits-all either. Some ship graves were massive and extravagant. Others were simple and modest. But the key was preservation. The ship wasn't destroyed. It was transformed into a tomb. So where does the burning come from? That fiery farewell comes mainly from literary sources like the Icelandic sagas and foreign eyewitness accounts. For example, Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan describes Aras's funeral, where a chieftain's ship was set on fire with a body and sacrificial victims inside. But even that example is complicated. It might not have been a full ship, but rather a symbolic structure shaped like one. It's possible that ship burnings did happen, especially in regions where burial wasn't feasible or where fire held symbolic weight. A cremation at sea would make sense if burial land was limited, or if the person was meant to join the gods in dramatic fashion. But from an archaeological standpoint, burned ship remains are extremely rare. In truth, the idea of a burning ship may have been as important as the act itself. Fire was sacred to the Norse. It was purified. It transformed. A flaming ship wasn't just a spectacle. It was a spiritual engine, sending the soul through smoke to the gods above. But burial had advantages. It preserved its legacy. It left a physical monument, something the living could return to. A mound was a marker, a memory on Earth. And that mattered in a society where honor, lineage, and saga were everything. So which was real? Well, but buried ships left the bones of history behind. The flaming ones, they left only legend and smoke. Forget the stereotype of Viking women waiting at home, weaving by the hearth. In death, just like in life, Norse women could command awe, fear, and ceremony. And nowhere is that clearer than in the ship burials of Viking Age women, especially those that rivaled and sometimes outshone their male counterparts. The Oseberg burial remains the most striking example. Unearthed in 1904, it housed not one, but two women, one older, one younger, laid to rest in one of the most lavish Viking ships ever found. The ship itself was a masterpiece, sweeping curves, carved dragon heads, and planks fit for a king. But this wasn't a warrior's grave. It was a queen's, or possibly a vulva. Vulva was a seeress, a sorceress, a prophetess who walked the line between worlds, and the grave goods in Oseberg, wands, staff, and mystical animal, remains hint at ritual and magic. If the main figure was indeed a vulva, then the burial honored not just political power, but spiritual authority. In Norse society, that could be just as influential as swordsmanship. And then there's the sheer wealth. Sledges, carts, textiles, tapestries, imported silks, ceremonial beds, and sacrificed animals all packed around these women as if they were being sent not just to the afterlife, but to continue ruling it. Other graves across Scandinavia confirm this pattern. The Gosel Queen, buried near Stavanger, was laid to rest with gold jewelry, imported bronze vessels, and fine riding gear. Her grave radiated status. The Ladby ship also showed signs of high-status female interment, and scholars still debate whether some warrior graves, complete with weapons, belong to women. DNA evidence from a grave in Birka, Sweden, suggests that one high-ranking warrior buried with a full arsenal was biologically female. So what does this tell us? That in Viking culture, women could hold power and take it with them, whether as aristocrats, queens, priestesses, or shield maidens. They weren't excluded from the ship burials. They were centered in them. They didn't just accompany kings in death. Sometimes they were the kings. When a Viking was buried in a ship, they didn't go alone. They were sent off with grave goods, a curated collection of the objects they might need, want, or deserve in the afterlife. But this wasn't just about swords and silver. These ships were packed like time capsules, giving us a strange and fascinating window into Viking life and Viking death. First, the weapons. Almost every elite ship burial includes them. Swords with decorated hilts, spears, shields, and battle axes. But these weren't just backups for ghost fighting in Valhalla. They were a statement. A sword showed that the dead had power, status, and honor. In some cases, the blades were deliberately bent or broken, not out of disrespect, but to kill the weapon and let it follow its master to the afterlife. But weapons weren't the only tools packed for the voyage. There were everyday items too. Combs, cooking pots, whetstones, even board games. These burials didn't assume the afterlife was an endless battlefield. The dead might still need to groom themselves, prepare meals, or pass the time with a quick game of Nefertiti while waiting for Ragnarok. It was a full-service departure. Then there were the animals. Lots of animals. In the Gokstad burial alone, archaeologists found the remains of 12 horses, 8 dogs, and 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks. Horses were meant to carry the soul. Dogs were loyal companions, and peacocks, possibly a status symbol, or maybe just an extravagant touch by someone who didn't want to be upstaged in death. The most unsettling grave goods were people. Slaves, servants, or companions were sometimes sacrificed and placed in a ship to accompany the dead. Whether they went willingly or not is up for debate, but their presence speaks volumes about Viking beliefs in duty beyond death. Everything in a ship burial was chosen deliberately. It told a story. This person was a warrior. This person loved fine clothing. This one had wealth. That one had power. Grave goods weren't junk. They were a final biography, written in gold, iron, and bone, and once packed, sealed, and buried, The ship became a floating home beneath the earth. While the image of a Viking ship burial often conjures up the fjords of Norway, these elaborate funerary practices weren't confined to a single region. From icy Scandinavia to the river valleys of Eastern Europe, Viking ship burials took on unique forms, each tailored to local traditions, terrain, and power structures. Let's begin with Norway, the homeland of the most famous ship burials like Oseberg and Gokstad. These were grand mound-covered ships buried with kings, queens, and nobles. Norway's rugged landscape offered excellent preservation conditions, allowing wooden ships and grave goods to survive for centuries. The focus here was on monumentality, large burial mounds and ships carved with mythic imagery. It was less about hiding the dead and more about displaying their status to the living. In Sweden, ship burials took on a slightly different flavor. At sites like Vindel and Valsgård, ships weren't always buried whole. Sometimes just the shape of the ship was outlined with stones, like a skeletal frame on the landscape. These stone ship settings were often used in cremation burials, with the ashes placed in urns or scattered within the stone enclosure. The Swedes embraced a hybrid of fire and stone, powerful symbolism, without the need for massive earthworks. Then there's the Rus, the Norse-descended warriors and traders who settled along the river routes of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The most detailed account of their funerary customs comes from Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a dramatic ship-burning ceremony along the Volga River. While archaeological evidence of full ship burials in the East is rarer, boat-shaped cremation mounds and grave goods echo the same core values: a journey, a transition, and a spectacle. In Denmark, evidence for ship burials is more fragmentary. The marshy soils aren't kind to wood preservation, and fewer ship graves have survived. But stone ship settings and elite graves with seafaring symbolism suggest that the practice, though perhaps less monumental, was still present. Even in Scotland, Ireland, and parts of the Baltic, boat-shaped graves appear, sometimes as literal ships, other times just as stone outlines. Wherever Vikings traveled, they brought their belief in the ship as the ultimate vehicle across water, across time, across death. The ship's burial was adaptable. It evolved, but the message remained the same. You don't walk into the afterlife, you sail there. For the Vikings, death was not the end. It was a departure. And that's what makes ship burials so powerful. They weren't just about honoring the dead with a flashy funeral. They were built on a deep mythic belief that the afterlife was a voyage, where the soul needed a vessel. In Norse cosmology, the world was shaped by water. From the great ocean encircling Midgard to the rivers that separated realms, everything flowed. Life came from the sea, and so naturally did death. It's no coincidence that ships appear in Viking mythology not only as tools of war and trade, but as spiritual bridges. Consider Naglfar, the ship made of the fingernails of the dead, which sails during Ragnarok to unleash chaos upon the gods. Or Skidbladner, the magical ship of the god Freya, which could fold up and fit in a pocket, yet always had a favorable wind. These mythic ships weren't just stories. They shaped real funerary practices. Every buried longship echoed the legends, turning myth into ritual. To be buried in a ship meant you were going somewhere. Valhalla, perhaps a glorious hall for warriors who died bravely. Or Folkvanga, the field ruled by the goddess Freya, where half of the slain went. Or for those who didn't earn honor, the gloomy realm of hell, ruled by a half-rotting goddess of the same name. Wherever your soul went, it didn't walk, it sailed. And the sea journey didn't just apply to elite warriors. Even humble cremation burials often included boat shapes formed by stones or wood, marking the dead's passage across unseen waters. The ship was a metaphor made real, carving through both waves and worlds. Viking funeral ships were cosmic tools. By placing the dead in a vessel surrounded by weapons, animals, and treasure, they weren't just provisioning a tomb. They were arming a traveler, someone about to cross the divide between Midgard and the great beyond. And to the living, the ship wasn't a final goodbye. It was a launch, a reminder that the journey didn't end in the grave. It only changed course. 1,000 years have passed since the last Viking ship burial slid into the earth, but their stories are still unfolding. These vessels of death, once buried in silence, now speak louder than ever through museums, excavations, and the imagination of millions. Today, the Oseberg, Gokstad, and Thun ships rest in glass-walled halls in Norway, preserved not as morbid relics, but as cultural treasures. Tourists stare up at the curved prows, marveling at the craftsmanship, the symbolism, the audacity of people who turned a boat into a coffin and a grave into a gateway. These ships were never meant to sail again. And yet they have not crossed oceans, but through time. And it's not just archaeologists who are listening. Writers, filmmakers, and game designers continue to be inspired by Viking funerals. From epic scenes in movies like The 13th Warrior or How to Train Your Dragon to blazing send-offs in TV shows like Vikings, the ship's burial has become one of the most iconic images of Norse culture. Is it historically accurate every time? Not really. But the spirit remains. Death as a voyage, the ship as a symbol. Even modern Scandinavians feel the echo. Some Viking descendants have requested ashes to be scattered at sea, or ceremonies modeled after ship burials. No slaves, thankfully, but still honoring that deep connection between the vessel and the soul. A few brave experimental archaeologists have even rebuilt burial ships, launching replicas on rivers and seas to understand the engineering and magic of the originals. What's truly remarkable is how much we've learned from the ships themselves. Their wood tells us about forests now gone. Their construction reveals knowledge of engineering, rivaling that of the Mediterranean. And their grave goods, peacocks, silk, silver coins, map a Viking world far wider than just Scandinavia. The Viking ship burial wasn't just a funeral. It was a final performance, one last act in a life of war, trade, poetry, and power. And even now, these ships are still performing, reminding us that the dead were once alive, that myth and memory are hard to separate, and that some vessels never stop moving. They just sail through different seas. Courtly love wasn't about marriage, procreation, or building a stable home. It was about longing, impossibility, and a strange blend of suffering and ecstasy. And by the 12th century, this concept had become so popular among the nobility that it actually developed its own unwritten rule book, part seduction manual, part philosophical exercise, and entirely out of sync with reality. Born in the courts of southern France, especially in the region of Aquitaine, courtly love was less about real emotion and more about performance. Noblemen, and often knights, would devote themselves to a lady, usually of higher status or already married. But instead of aiming to win her over in a romantic sense, the knight's goal was to worship her from afar. He would compose poems, undertake dangerous quests in her name, and suffer gloriously in silence. If this sounds like emotional masochism dressed up in armor, it kind of was. The rules were clear. Love must be secret, it must be difficult, and it must never be fully consummated, because once fulfilled, the love lost its purity. In this game, suffering was the point. A knight's heartbreak was proof of his devotion. The more helpless the love, the nobler the spirit. This new code of love intertwined with the ideals of chivalry, the knightly code of honor, service, and bravery. A perfect knight was brave in battle and humble before his lady. Love wasn't a distraction from knighthood. It was a test of it. A knight who could endure heartbreak without breaking his vows or honor was the true ideal. And yet, courtly love was deeply hypocritical. While the knight composed flowery verses about his lady's golden hair and impossible grace, her marriage to a powerful nobleman continued undisturbed. And while the ideals emphasized restraint and virtue, history is littered with affairs, scandals, and even duels sparked by these supposedly platonic obsessions. Still, the idea caught fire. Poets, troubadours, and minstrels made careers crafting tales of knights who bled for love, ladies who wept for honor, and the eternal ache of desire unfulfilled. Real or not, the fantasy of courtly love reshaped how medieval Europe thought about passion, power, and gender. Love had become more than an emotion. It had become a code. Before Shakespeare or sonnets, there were troubadours, wandering poet-musicians who turned unrequited love into an art form, one lute note and heartbreak stanza at a time. These were not peasants singing about ale and harvests. They were often nobles themselves, well-educated, multilingual, and well aware of how dangerous and addictive it was to sing about another man's wife. The troubadour movement began in Occitania, in what is now southern France during the late 11th and early 12th centuries. These performers composed songs in Occitan, a Romance language, and their subject was nearly always the same. Unattainable love, a knight hopelessly enamored with a noble lady, a lady trapped in marriage but worshipped from afar. It was all beautifully orchestrated misery. Troubadour songs weren't performed in smoky taverns, but in the great halls of castles. The audience, lords and ladies who saw their own secret desires mirrored in the verses. A good troubadour could make a duchess blush with a single metaphor. A great one could start a scandal that lasted for generations. These poets developed a refined vocabulary of longing, fine amour, or refined love. It wasn't about lust, but about admiration, humility, and internal agony. Love, in their view, was supposed to hurt. The lady was always placed on a pedestal, near divine and untouchable. The man, often a knight or poet, would express his worth through service, suffering, and soul-bearing lyricism. Some of the most famous troubadours were actual historical figures: Jefferudel, who claimed to have fallen in love with a woman he'd never met, Bernard of Ventadorn, who turned heartbreak into hit songs, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a patron of the arts who likely inspired many of these tales and perhaps lived them too. Troubadours didn't just invent medieval love songs. They invented the idea that expressing love through art was noble, even holy. Their influence spread across Europe, giving rise to similar traditions in Italy with the Dolce Stil Novo, Germany with the Minzingers, and eventually England. What they started was bigger than music. It was a cultural obsession that would define how love was written, sung, and mythologized for centuries. They didn't just perform for the court, they taught the court how to love. In the world of courtly love, the woman was everything. Muse, judge, goddess, untouchable prize. She sat on a metaphorical and sometimes literal pedestal, worshipped by knights, and praised in verse. But this glorification wasn't exactly empowering. It was flattering, yes, but also confining, idealized, and often impossible to live up to. The lady of courtly romance was typically noble, married, and out of reach, and that was the point. The more unattainable she was, the more pure the love seemed. Her beauty was described in impossibly poetic terms: skin like ivory, eyes like stars, hair like woven gold. But these women weren't described as real individuals. They were more like living symbols, meant to inspire devotion and suffering in equal measure. For men, this idealization offered a noble excuse for emotional vulnerability. A knight could weep, sigh, or write poetry without being seen as weak, because his love for this lady was considered sacred. For women, however, it was a trap. They were expected to inspire love without ever acting on it. They had to maintain their grace, dignity, and virtue at all times, while being watched, desired, and sometimes stalked by persistent suitors armed with ballads. Occasionally, the lady held real power in these dynamics. In some tales, she was the one setting challenges, commanding loyalty, or even testing her knight's devotion. But this power was almost always symbolic. In reality, most noblewomen had limited freedom, often married off for alliances and status before they were 15. And yet courtly love gave them something rare in the Middle Ages: visibility. In a world dominated by men's voices, courtly love placed women at the center of the narrative. They became the subject of songs, the reason for quests, and the heart of medieval romantic imagination. Some women played the game well. Historical figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne weren't just muses. They were patrons of this culture, encouraging poets and commissioning love literature that reflected their ideals and sometimes their politics. But even at its best, courtly love wasn't about partnership. It was about distance, elevation, and longing. The lady was adored, but rarely known. She was a fantasy with a crown, and fantasies don't get to speak. Chivalry began as a practical battlefield code. Loyalty to lord, courage under fire, mercy to the fallen. But once courtly love seeped into the armor, chivalry grew a silk-lined interior. Every lance charge, every oath, every polished spur could now double as a love letter. A knight no longer fought only for king and kingdom. He fought for the smile, or even the rumor of a smile of a distant lady, a perfect courtly knight. followed a three-tiered hierarchy of loyalties. First, God, morning prayers before dawn patrols. Second, his feudal lord, unquestioned service in war and peace. Third, his lady, the invisible beacon guiding every gesture. Where earlier warriors hoisted battle standards, the courtly knight tied a lady's token, perhaps a ribbon, a veil, or a sleeve around his arm. It wasn't camouflage. It was a public declaration that his sword's edge carried a private agenda. Tournaments, originally blunt weapon training grounds, transformed into love theater. Lists surrounding the tilting field were draped with banners, and each knight announced whose favor he bore. A victorious tilt wasn't merely a martial triumph. It proved a lover's worthiness. Chroniclers record knights collapsing from exhaustion. Rather than withdrawing and risking the shame of appearing less devoted than their rivals, that devotion demanded self-discipline, bordering on asceticism. Manuals like Andreas Capellanus's De More preached that a true lover remained humble, courteous, and discreet. He must guard her reputation more fiercely than his own life, endure jealous rivals without complaint, and cruelest rule of all, rejoice in service, even if love were never returned. The pain itself was proof of sincerity. Yet beneath the velvet rhetoric lurked steel-clad reality. Castles needed garrisons, roads teemed with bandits, and foreign crusades beckoned. Knights wrote poetry at night, but sharpened blades at dawn. The same hand that tenderly pinned a rondo could sever a helm in battle hours later. Medieval commentators noticed the contradiction, but that paradox was the point. The greater the contrast between brutality and tenderness, the nobler the knight. Of course, real hearts complicated the code. Secret trysts happened, scandals erupted, reputations shattered. But the ideal remained tantalizing. A harmony where courage met courtesy, where a warrior's strength bowed to a lady's grace for a medieval audience drowning in wars and arranged marriages. That ideal was intoxicating. Thus chivalry, armored in iron yet perfumed with longing, became the operating system of aristocratic romance. Fight hard, love harder, preferably from a respectful poetic distance. Every code invites a breach, and courtly love, so obsessed with secrecy and yearning, practically begged for real-world transgression beneath the airy verses and tournament pageantry. Simmered flesh and blood temptation. When fantasy stepped off the parchment, it ignited some of the Middle Ages' juiciest scandals. Take Peter Abelard and Heloise. Abelard was Europe's rock star philosopher, Heloise, his brilliant teenage student. Their relationship began like a textbook courtly romance, secret lessons turning into poetry and stolen glances until it became very real, very physical, and very public. The fallout was brutal. A furious uncle, a clandestine child, a forced marriage, Abelard's infamous castration, and both lovers ending their days in separate monasteries, composing letters that dripped equal parts theology and heartbreak. Courtly ideals promised ennobling devotion. Reality delivered mutilation and lifelong penance. High politics weren't immune either. Eleanor of Aquitaine, doyen of troubadour culture, was whispered to have entertained flirtations aplenty, most notoriously with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers during the Second Crusade. Whether true or not, the rumors helped poison her marriage to Louis VII and reshape the map of Europe when she married Henry Plantagenet. Love songs could topple thrones. Even royal daughters weren't safe. The Tour de Nesle affair of 1314 saw 3 French princesses accused, thanks to a servant's gossip of adulterous rendezvous in a Parisian tower. 2 marriages were annulled. Alleged lovers were flayed and hanged. The disgraced women spent years in convent prisons. Chivalric rhetoric praised female virtue. The justice system had iron chains waiting when virtue cracked. Then there were the quieter tragedies. Nameless ladies banished to remote castles for exchanging letters, knights forced onto crusade as penance for suspicion of dalliance, abbots preaching sermons that compared a wandering heart to a rusted sword. The church never outlawed courtly love outright, but ecclesiastical courts issued plenty of fines for inordinate familiarity, proof that passion, however poetically packaged, still breached canonical law. What these episodes reveal is the tension at the core of chivalric romance, the celebration of illicit desire coupled with a rigid social order determined to punish it. The same society that applauded a knight's size expected him to stop short of consummation. When vows slipped, reputations burned, sometimes literally. Thus, the dream of refined devotion collided with the hard stone of medieval power. Courtly love could inspire poetry. Yes, it could also wreck lives, and every scandal only sharpened the allure of the next whispered liaison, because nothing fuels a romance like the promise of ruin. If troubadours composed the soundtrack of courtly love, medieval authors provided the big-budget cinematic universe. Beginning in the late 12th century, writers like Chrétien de Troyes took the raw material of longing, secrecy, and knightly angst, and forged the first blockbuster romances, prose and verse narratives where love was not a subplot but the engine of destiny. Enter King Arthur's court, a fictional laboratory for every chivalric dilemma. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Cretan unveiled the ultimate courtly triangle, the flawless Queen Guinevere, her duty-bound husband Arthur, and the peerless but fatally smitten Sir Lancelot. Lancelot performs impossible feats, crosses a sword-blade bridge, defeats entire armies. Yet his greatest trial is emotional, loving a woman he can never openly claim. Cruchen packed the tale with all the rules of fine armor, secret meetings, symbolic tokens, and the ever-present threat of ruin. Readers went wild. Knights suddenly wanted to be Lancelot, except for the lifelong adultery headache. Arthurian romance spread like wildfire across Europe. In Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach gave us Parzival, where the hero's spiritual maturation is inseparable from his respect for chaste love. In England, later poets stitched together sprawling cycles, the Vulgate cycle, the Post-Vulgate, and ultimately Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century Le Morte d'Arthur, which sealed Arthurian tragedy into Western canon. Love is glory. Love is downfall. Not all literary romances wore plate armor. Around 1230, Guillaume de Loris began The Romance of the Rose, an allegorical dreamscape where the beloved rose is locked inside a walled garden and every courtly virtue, humility, courtesy, pity takes human form. For decades later, Ginderman continued it, adding biting satire that mocked clerics, nobles, and the very love code readers adored. The poem became the Middle Ages' most owned bestseller, copied in hundreds of manuscripts and debated in university halls. Was it a moral handbook or a body parody? Yes, these texts did more than entertain. They standardized the language of yearning. Metaphors. Love as service, the beloved as shining light, jealousy as a dungeon, became cliches precisely because bards and lovers alike borrowed them wholesale. Even real courts used romances as etiquette manuals. How to bow, speak, flatter, despair correctly. Literary romance thus performed a sly double act. It celebrated the ideals troubadours praised, bravery for love's sake, while simultaneously exposing their contradictions. Fiction made courtly love feel grander than life and truer than truth, ensuring the generations who never met a troubadour still learned how to ache with impeccable style. Courtly love's perfume didn't reach heaven unnoticed. As troubadour refrains floated over castle walls, bishops smelled sulfur. How could a culture that exalted adultery, emotional idolatry, and carefully managed lust coexist with Christian teaching on fidelity and humility? Spoiler: it couldn't. At least not without a holy tug-of-war. Preachers struck first. By the early 13th century, sermon collections like Jacques de Vitry's exemplar warned congregations of knights who rode to tournaments for a lady's ribbon and returned with a ticket to damnation. The Dominican Stephen of Bourbon labeled troubadours peddlers of vanity, whose songs corroded both chastity and social order. Moralists coined the term amour d'eau, disordered love, to separate proper marital affection from the poetic fever sweeping court halls. Ecclesiastical courts followed with fines and penances. A knight discovered exchanging love tokens during Lent might be sentenced to a barefoot pilgrimage or forced to fund church candles, a literal fee for flaunting figurative fire. Confessors' manuals advised priests to grill penitents about clandestine liaisons, suspicious poetry exchanges, even excessive daydreaming. Desire itself became a taxable offense, payable in prayers. Yet repression was complicated by patronage. Many great patrons of love poetry, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie de Champagne, Blanche of Castile, were also enthusiastic benefactors of monasteries and cathedrals. Bishops condemning courtly verse on Sunday might dine with a poetry-loving queen on Tuesday. Excommunication, therefore, remained mostly rhetorical. Social capitulation proved more pragmatic. Some clerics tried jujitsu instead of censure. Andreas Capellanus's De More commission, legend says, by Marie de Champagne, presents 31 rules of love, only to conclude with a chapter advising readers to renounce the whole system as sinful folly. The treatise functions like a carnival mirror, reflecting courtly ideals so precisely that they reveal their own absurdity. Moral commentary disguised as manual. Satirists piled on. The Roman de la Rose, especially Jean de Meune's continuation, portrays courtly seduction techniques as both entertaining and morally bankrupt. Jealous husbands appear, nurses peddle tricks, and the heroine's virtue is finally breached. The poem became university study material, proof that laughter could wound deeper than anathema. Despite all this pushback, courtly love survived because it offered something sermons rarely did: emotional drama. People don't abandon theater for lectures. The church slowed the fever, trimmed its excesses, but failed to exercise the desire to desire. By the 14th century, moralists still thundered, but troubadour DNA had already mingled with European culture. Cupid, slightly chastened, kept strumming, just softer, and with one wary eye on the pulpit. By the mid-14th century, the glitter on courtly love was flaking. Wars, plagues, and new money blurred the tidy hierarchies that had once made longing from afar feel fashionable. Knights were now hiring themselves out as mercenaries. Troubadours competed with itinerant jongleur in Europe's mood ravaged by the Black Death, tilted from silk and sighs towards sackcloth and survival. Yet the old language of love did not vanish. It mutated into something subtler: courtesy. Courtesy books such as the Book of the Courtier of 1528 by Baldassare Castiglione repackaged chivalric poses for Renaissance courts. Instead of bleeding under a lady's window, the polished courtier displayed sprezzatura, effortless grace through dancing, witty banter, and lightly veiled admiration. Yearning remained, but desperation became gauche. Love was still a game. The rules simply swapped chainmail for velvet doublets. Literature mirrored the shift. Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Chryside, c. 1385, presents lovers trapped between courtly ideals and brutal fate. Troilus worships with textbook devotion, yet politics and plague break the fantasy later in the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer pokes fun at knights whose rhetoric outshines their ethics, signaling that audiences now found equal pleasure in parody. Printing presses amplified change. Where hand-copied romances had circulated among elites, cheap chapbooks spread love templates to merchants and artisans. Ballads about the nut-brown maid or Sir Aldingar condensed centuries of chivalric angst into compact, hum-along tragedies. Love talk became mass culture, less refined, more democratic, and increasingly colored by earthy humor. Meanwhile, real politics complicated flirtation. In France and Burgundy, courts of love, mock tribunals where ladies judged amorous disputes, gradually faded as central monarchies grew wary of aristocrats using romantic pageants to forge cliques. Kings preferred loyalty oaths over love oaths. Yet vestiges endured. Tournaments kept awarding ladies favors. Young nobles still learned lute chords to serenade balconies. Heraldry manuals maintained that a knight might bear a heart of flame on his shield for a maiden's honor. Even the emerging genre of Valentine's Day poetry, first recorded in the 15th century, echoed courtly vocabulary of service, secrecy, and sweet pain. Thus, courtly love never truly died. It shed its armor, slipped into silk, and strolled into the Renaissance, disguised as refined etiquette. The dream of ennobling desire proved too intoxicating to abandon, so Europe rewrote the script, softening its tragedies and selling its tropes to every social stratum. Love was still a ritual. The stage sets just changed. Courtly love faded as a social practice, but its DNA threads through Western romance like gilt ink on vellum. When the Renaissance traded chainmail for satin, Petrarch and sonneteers simply recast the unattainable lady as Laura, and Shakespeare turned the trope inside out, making Juliet equal partner to her awestruck Romeo. The suffering and silence ideal morphed into the grand gesture, balcony speeches, secret letters, roses tossed beneath moonlit windows. Medieval rituals in Elizabethan costume. The Enlightenment mocked chivalric excess, yet still prized sensibility. The sweet ache of unspoken longing. Jane Austen's heroines might scoff at knights, but Darcy's silent devotion to Elizabeth echoes Lancelot's mute adoration, only now tempered by moral accountability and mutual respect. Romantic-era poets cranked the pathos to 11. Byron's "She Walks in Beauty" would feel perfectly at home recited before a 12th century duchess. Victorian etiquette manuals re-weaponized courtesy, calling cards, chaperone dances, even the language of flowers all owed debts to medieval symbolism, tokens signifying devotion while maintaining the fiction of restraint. When the industrial city replaced the castle, love still required choreography, and society still judged lovers by their mastery of coded signals. Cinema inherited the pageant. Silent film swashbucklers wooed damsels with swordplay and soulful stares. Hollywood's golden age polished the archetype into tuxedos and ballroom gowns. Every rom-com that hinges on a single kiss after 90 minutes of tension is reenacting the central premise of courtly love. Anticipation is sweeter than consummation. Even superhero sagas keep the flame alive. Think of Spider-Man swinging across skyscrapers just to leave a rose for Mary Jane. The battlefield changed, not the devotion. Digital culture paradoxically revives the medieval distance. Online fandoms idolize celebrities they will never meet, composing fan fiction as troubadours once composed Kansas. Emoji hearts and reaction gifts replace loot chords, yet the dynamic is identical. Exalted beloved yearning admirer, endless scroll of unfulfilled desire. Meanwhile, shipping wars mirror tournaments of old minus the lances. Critics call these patterns artificial, even toxic, and they can be courtly love always balanced on the edge of obsession. Yet its endurance proves humans still crave narrative frameworks for passion, rules, quests, symbols, drama. We may say we want realistic love, but ticket sales suggest otherwise. The dream persists because it flatters both emotion and imagination. Your eyes open before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, because you're anxious. You're the planner of tonight's elite Roman orgy, which means your brain has already conjured 17 things that could go wrong before breakfast. Your sleeping mat is still warm, your tunic is wrinkled, and someone has already shoved a scroll under your door. It crackles ominously. You unroll it with the grim resolve of a soldier reading his draft notice. It's from your patron's wife, who would like to remind you that last time the rose petals were yellow, not red. And guest noticed. You haven't even touched your barley yet. Outside, Rome is just waking up. But you're already juggling flaming amphorae in your mind. Today's guest list includes senators, artists, philosophers, two courtesans who hate each other, and rumor has it someone from the imperial family. Of course, no one tells you. Could be a cousin. Could be Caligula. Either way, you'll be blamed if someone's peacock isn't sufficiently massaged. You step into your sandals and begin a day like any good Roman orgy planner with dread and a clipboard. First order of business. Staffing. You sent runners yesterday to book flute girls, dancers, a harpist, and a man who walks on his hands while balancing a tray of figs on his feet. None have been confirmed. You suspect at least 2 are currently drunk in the suburbs. Then there's the food. You've requested oysters, honey-roasted dormice, figs, dates, olives, and several questionable meats from the eastern provinces. Everything must arrive fresh, or at least freshish. One bad oyster, and half the forum will be whispering that you poisoned Senator Gaius. Oh, and don't forget the cushions. Last time, one of the divans collapsed under a toga-heavy magistrate, and the fallout was political this time. The couches must be sturdy enough to handle whatever happens on them, and you know exactly what happens on them. The sun is barely up, and you're already sweating into your linen. You take a breath. You remind yourself you are a professional, a maestro of madness, a choreographer of chaos. It's going to be a long day, but the cushions will be fluffed, the wine will be poured, and the guests will never know how close you came to screaming. Not yet, anyway. It's still early, and already you're unrolling a fresh scroll. Today's updated guest list. You read it slowly, bracing for disaster. It's not a seating chart. It's a delicately balanced social powder keg with olives on top. Lucius Calpurnius Piso is attending. Naturally, he comes to everything and always insists on reclining on the center couch, preferably next to someone else's wife. Problem is, his wife Aurelia is also coming. She wasn't invited, but that's never stopped her before. You make a note. Separate couches, separate wine sources, and definitely no harp solos while they're both in the room. Last time she threw a garum jug. Next, Senator Petronius Arbiter has accepted. A witty man, a dangerous man known for his tongue, and not always in a poetic sense. You'll need to seat him far from Junius Blasis, whose poetry Petronius once described as a slow death written in meter. Then you spot it. Domitianus and two guests unnamed. The vagueness is offensive. Could be respected clients, could be gladiators, could be a giraffe in a toga. You write flexible seating, West End and move on. Now for the entertainers, 4 flute girls, 3 dancers, and the mime twins. That's already one more performer than Lucullus approves of. He considers mimes barbaric. His mistress, however, finds him delightful, and he finds his mistress's approval critical to his reputation. The guest list isn't just a set of names, it's a living map of ancient Roman tension. Politics, power, lust, family feuds, and vendettas, all reclining together on silk-covered couches, drinking from the same communal bowl of wine. And of course, the real terror. Someone important who wasn't invited. You can already hear the whispered accusations. It was intentional. A public insult. I'll never lend him my bath slaves again. You roll up the scroll. You make a new one. You draw arrows, add warnings, circle names. You're not planning a party. You're managing a live diplomatic simulation with aphrodisiacs and roasted dormice. Still, you've done this before. You'll do it again. You just hope this time no one stabs anyone over couch placement. Not like last spring. With the guest list finalized, or at least stable enough not to implode, it's time for the next crisis. Provisioning. Planning a Roman orgy isn't about pouring wine and lighting torches. It's about curating a menu so decadent it makes the gods feel underdressed. Your list is already 3 tablets long. Let's start with the basics. Wine. Not just any wine. It must be Falernian, aged, and expensive enough to make your sponsor wince. You write 3 amphorae Falernian, 2 of Cacuban for show, 1 of vinegar to serve to the guests who arrive late. Next, oysters imported fresh from Baiae must be alive when they arrive, or at least convincingly moist. You send a note to the seafood vendor reminding him that last time half the oysters were already dead and one guest declared it an omen. He's still recovering. Then there's honey-roasted dormice, a staple of Roman decadence, rolled in poppy seeds and dipped in honey. They must be plump, not stringy. You ask for 50. You'll receive 35. Half will still twitch. You add roasted peacock, stuffed sows, butter, dates from Judea, figs from Carthage, cheese wrapped in vine leaves. You also scribble down a reminder. No garum accidents near the bread this time. The last event's anchovy-scented rolls nearly caused a riot. For dessert, you'll need candied nuts, almond cakes, and some sort of visual spectacle. Perhaps a cake shaped like the Colosseum filled with live songbirds. You'll figure out the baking logistics later. Then comes the perfume budget. Myrrh rosol, saffron water, enough incense to make a Vestal virgin dizzy. You make a note, discreetly sent to latrines. You stare at the list. It looks more like a military requisition than a menu, and it costs more than a decent villa outside Ostia. But this is Rome. Opulence is expected. Gluttony is style, and your patron's reputation depends on guests being too stunned by luxury to notice that the music is out of tune. And someone spilled wine on the marble lions. You hand the scroll to your fastest runner with strict instructions. No substitutions, no apologies. And if he forgets the sugar grapes again, I'm feeding him to the flamingos. Time to pray to Mercury, god of commerce and delivery. Let's clear something up right away. A vomitorium isn't what you think it is. No. Romans didn't build special rooms just to purge mid-feast and make room for more peacock. That's a later myth, probably invented by someone who watched Romans eat and couldn't imagine another explanation. The vomitorium, in reality, refers to the entrance and exit passages in Roman amphitheaters where crowds spewed out after events. But that doesn't stop modern imaginations from picturing marble-tiled throw-up lounges filled with perfumed nobles and feather fans. That said, Romans did overindulge, and if a guest quietly excused themselves to step out and refresh, no one asked questions. So as an orgy planner, it's your job to make sure the entire venue, from atrium to triclinium to discreet garden alcove, is ready to absorb the consequences of excess in style. You begin the inspection. The banquet hall floors must gleam mosaic tiles, especially the part with Bacchus riding a panther that needs quick polish. You personally remove a grape stem stuck in the ground from last week's gathering. You know your standards. The latrines are cleaned, perfumed and stocked with fresh sponges on sticks. The lemon-scented vinegar is refreshed. A candle burns gently near the doorway, not for light, for dignity. Out in the courtyard, you double-check the fountain basins. Guests have a habit of reclining too far and toppling in after their fifth goblet. Last time, the general's wife nearly drowned in the koi pond. You've since removed the koi. You can't remove the wife. You pass through the perfume room where oils and salves are arranged like an apothecary for indulgence. Rose, cinnamon, myrrh. You sample one and your wrist smells like a love letter to Venus. Perfect. Next you inspect the vomitorium myth room. That is, a quiet hallway with a curtain, a chair, a bronze basin, and a polite slave station with a fan. It's not called that, of course. It's called the retreat. But everyone knows what it's for, and it too must sparkle clean, scented, and luxurious. No matter how indulgent things get tonight, no one leaves this party feeling undignified. If they do purge, they'll do it surrounded by polished marble and tasteful murals of satyrs. That's your promise. It's mid-morning, and it's time for the most delicate part of your job. Not selecting wines, not managing nobles, but addressing the staff. A Roman feast of this magnitude requires people. Lots of people. And none of them woke up today hoping to be part of another nobleman's indulgent fever dream. You gather the team in the atrium, 23 bodies, each with a role. Most are slaves, some born in the household. Some bought for the specific purpose of carrying trays, pouring wine, or looking attractive while silent. A few are paid performers. All are stressed. First up, cupbearers. You assign them their zones. Central triclinium, periphery lounge, west garden. Dilute the strong wine unless told otherwise, you remind them. Some guests think they can handle full Falernian. They cannot. Fan bearers are next. Crucial role. Their timing can make or break a guest's comfort. One gust too strong and you've blown out a candle or exposed someone's secrets. One too weak and someone sweats into a silk cushion. Neither is acceptable. Fruit attendants, yes, they're a thing, are instructed to refresh trays constantly, peel grapes only upon request, and discreetly remove any fruit that begins to resemble a raisin. Then there are the musicians already bickering about tempo. You separate the flute girl from the lyre player. Last time, their disagreement turned into a duet, so awkward the guests stopped mid-feast to offer them marriage counseling. The dancers, all oil and eyeliner, lean dramatically against the pillar, pretending not to listen. You run through their cues anyway. No improvisation, you say sharply. We are not reliving the Bakshik fire incident. You make eye contact with the youngest slave, a boy no older than 10, who's responsible for collecting discarded sandals. You nod once. He nods back. A silent pact is made. He will not fail you. Finally, you give your usual speech. Tonight you are invisible unless summoned. You are silent unless spoken to. You are grace, rhythm, and elegance incarnate, or I swear by Jupiter. I will assign you to sponge duty until Saturnalia. There's a pause, then a collective nod. Briefings are complete. You take a breath. The human engine behind Roman debauchery is oiled, powdered, and aligned for now. It happens every time. The invitations go out, the wine arrives, the silk cushions are plumped, and just when you begin to feel marginally in control, someone hurries into the atrium. Out of breath with that familiar look, the musicians haven't arrived. Of course they haven't. You grit your teeth. You specifically booked a flute girl, two cithara players, and one backup Alas duo in case of exactly this situation. And yet here you are, staring down the barrel of silence at a party where silence is considered a civic offense. You send your most reliable runner to the Subura district, Rome's chaotic marketplace of noise, smells, and bad decisions. Find them. You instruct, alive, conscious, and dressed. You don't even ask why they're late. You already know they're either still asleep, too drunk to walk, or tangled in a romantic entanglement that began at last night's Saturnalia rehearsal and never stopped. The dancers are now complaining that without musicians, they can't rehearse. The poets are delighted. Assuming this means more stage time, you quickly squash that idea. No one wants Gaius's ode to his mother's third marriage recited at a party where people are eating sugar dormice. You consider contingency plans. The house cook knows 2 songs on a cracked reed pipe. A nearby slave has a decent singing voice if kept off the wine. Worst case, you hum in rhythm while someone shakes a jar of lentils. You pray it doesn't come to that. Then, like ghosts emerging from incense, the musicians appear fashionably disheveled, vaguely apologetic, and smelling faintly of spikenard and poor decisions. One of the flute girls is missing a sandal. The other looks as though she's had her heart broken by at least 3 senators. Still, they're here. You assign their stations, one in the atrium, one near the main dining hall, one in the garden for ambience. You stress. No dramatic tempo shifts. No dirges. No impromptu solos. Unless someone's actually dying. They nod. Sort of. You exhale. Crisis averted for now. But you keep your eye on the lyre player. He's tuning it slowly, lovingly. Far too lovingly for someone who isn't about to ruin everything with an improvised love ballad. You make a note. Station him near the door. Easy removal. If music is the soul of the party, seating is the strategy. You're not just placing guests on couches, you're navigating rivalries, romances, and enough unspoken tension to collapse a marble villa. The Roman triclinium, the classic 3-couch setup, seats 9, technically comfortably closer to 7. If no one brings their pet leopard, you begin by sketching it all out on a wax tablet, muttering to yourself like a general planning a siege. Center couch, that's where the status goes. The summus locus, the place of honor, is reserved for the guest of highest rank. Unfortunately, 2 people think they're that person. Senator Piso and Governor Crispus both claim the title by birth, marriage, and sheer self-confidence. You'll need to decide who gets the top spot and who gets mildly poison wine. You also need to keep lovers near each other, but not too near, unless they're ex-lovers, in which case they must be divided by an entire bowl of olives and someone charming but very boring in between. Then there are the seat fillers, charming but forgettable citizens who exist to keep the peace. You place a wealthy equestrian next to a dramatic poet to absorb the impact. The equestrian won't understand the poem, and the poet will love the attention. It's a symbiotic arrangement. You assign courtesans to strategic locations near the lonely, the rich, or the recently divorced. You also assign 2 of them to the west side, not because it matters, but because it will bother Aurelia and she needs something to complain about other than the wine temperature. Of course, you leave room for unpredictability. Someone will arrive uninvited. Someone will switch seats to make a statement. Someone will spill wine and demand a full reshuffling. You leave a few empty cushions, plausible deniability, last-minute flexibility, and a place for the poet to sulk if needed. With the seating plan finished, you admire your work like a sculptor regarding his marble, knowing full well someone will hit it with a hammer before sunset. You roll up the scroll and hand it off with this instruction. Place name tags in wax, and for the love of Jupiter, don't let anyone switch them. You know they will, but at least you tried. If the orgy is a performance, the kitchen is the backstage arena, and it smells like fire, figs, and utter panic. By mid-afternoon, the entire household is a choreography of controlled culinary chaos. The main cook, a former naval cook turned domestic warlord, is already shouting at a terrified assistant over the proper stuffing ratio for roasted dormice. You hear the words honey poppy seeds, and I will personally throw you into the Tiber. Excellent. Everything's on schedule. The main attraction tonight, Peacock roasted whole feathers reapplied for dramatic flair. It looks magnificent, tastes like shoe leather, and is mostly served so rich guests can brag about chewing something that had once strutted like a diva. The kitchen is also prepping a pig, which has been stuffed with live birds. Yes, that's a real thing. You roast the pig, slice it open at the table, and surprise, doves fly out. It's impressive, unsettling, and only mildly traumatic for the doves. Platters of figs, dates, and honey cakes line the counters. A pastry shaped like the Colosseum is being glazed. A slave accidentally eats part of it. He's promptly reassigned to grape fetching duty. In one corner, someone's stirring a vat of garum, that infamous Roman fish sauce. Made from fermented anchovies and the tears of anyone within sniffing range. You remind them loudly to keep it away from the bread. One garum-soaked loaf ruined last month's affair and started a 5-day feud between two magistrates. Meanwhile, the wine storage is being arranged. Amphory of Falernian for the main guests. Cheaper vintages for those who won't know the difference. You make sure the amphorae are labeled subtly. You've been burned before, literally, by an angry consul with a sensitive palate. Every corner of the kitchen hums with tension, platters being polished, sauces reduced, meats larded, and pastry horns filled with mystery. You're everywhere at once, sniffing, tasting, directing. You're not just managing a meal. You're managing an edible spectacle that's expected to impress, intoxicate, and survive being hurled during an argument. As you walk past the oven, head cook barks. If anyone drops another dormouse, I'm feeding them to the peacock. You know it. Things are going well. You think selecting a scent would be easy, but in ancient Rome, perfume is a statement, and tonight's orgy is no place for amateur olfactory choices. The guests won't just taste and see opulence. They need to smell it. The air must reek of wealth, temptation, and the kind of confidence only achievable by people who bathe in imported rose oil. So you descend into the storage chamber, where tiny alabaster jars line the shelves like sacred relics, myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon oil from Ceylon, saffron from Cilicia, and an experimental blend called Essence of Nile Lotus, which smells like an expensive pond. You've sniffed everyone twice. You begin composing the fragrant strategy like a battle plan. The atrium will smell of citrus and cedarwood, sharp, fresh, a clean opening note. The main triclinium. That's for heavier scents. Myrrh, frankincense, a touch of musk. It should whisper. You might make a mistake tonight. And that's okay. The private garden alcoves where secrets will be exchanged and togas will be strategically misplaced. Get the seductive blend. Rose, cinnamon, and just enough spikenard to make someone faint if they stand too close. Then there's the perfumed oils for guest hands and feet. You assign an attendant to warm them slightly. No one wants cold oil. Cold oil is for barbarians. Warm oil is for seduction. And good lighting. And yes, you've scented the latrines too. You're not a barbarian either. You instruct your staff. Don't oversin. We want luxury, not suffocation. If a senator walks in and blames the smell for his nosebleed, we've gone too far. One of the dancers requests a personal scent, something hypnotic. You give her a blend so potent it once caused a minor riot during a Saturnalia feast. You warn her. She smiles. She'll use it anyway. You walk through the halls, trailing your nose like a train hound. The atmosphere is beginning to bloom, warm, spiced, opulent. A perfumed breeze wafts through the triclinium like a whispered secret. You know it. This is what indulgence smells like. Scented, lit, and fully armed with aroma, the house is nearly ready to receive its guests. All it needs now is chaos. It's late afternoon. The air smells of warm citrus, roasted meat, and very expensive decisions. You've assigned every task, threatened everyone necessary, and bribed the harpist to stay sober until at least dessert. Now comes the moment of truth, the final walkthrough. You start at the entrance, where oil lamps are being lit one by one. They flicker gently across polished marble, casting a golden glow that says you're not poor. Not tonight. A flower boy sprinkles fresh petals at the threshold. You remind him not to overdo it. Last time, Someone slipped on lavender and sued into the atrium. The bronze fountains are running. Grapes are pyramid in absurdly impractical displays. Pillows have been beaten, fluffed, and positioned with unnatural symmetry. You move one slightly to make it look less staged. It's important that decadence feels effortless, even if it's taken 32 hours and 2 minor breakdowns to achieve. Next, the triclinium, the main event space. Tables are low. Recliners are perfectly angled. Each cushion has been dusted, perfumed, and strategically rotated to hide any wine stains from last month's senator's birthday disaster. You do a bounce test soft enough to comfort, firm enough to survive activity. You inspect the tableware. Silver goblets, bronze platters, blown glass amphorae. Bread is artfully arranged. Cheese is sweating slightly, but you decide it adds authenticity. You quietly remove a beetle from a fig. No one saw. It never happened in the garden alcoves. The lighting is soft and ambiguous, just dim enough to be flattering, just bright enough to avoid accidents involving potted plants and dignity. A servant fans incense. The effect is ethereal. You pause and let yourself enjoy it. Briefly, you spot a small detail. A flower out of place. You fix it. Another. A curtain that's not quite even. You adjust it. Final check. You inhale deeply. You listen. You walk through this space like a guest. It's beautiful. Ridiculous. Excessive. Perfect. You sigh for a moment. You let yourself believe it's all under control. Then someone rushes in. The guest of honor arrived early, and he brought 3 extra wives. Of course he did. You smile tightly, straighten your tunic, and step into the fray. The first knock is not so much a knock as it is a dramatic thump followed by laughter. You take a breath. Here we go. The door opens. The slave pulls back the curtain with just enough flourish to impress, but not overshadow. Your first guest, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, strolls in like he owns the place, despite not paying for any of it. He smells of strong wine, ambition, and imported cologne that cost more than a soldier's annual wage. He greets you with a grin and a wink. Tonight, my friend, we make Bacchus blush behind him. A trail of courtesans, a minor poet, and a man carrying a small lyre who may or may not be invited. You decide not to check. Guests begin pouring in flowing robes, gold-threaded tunics, embroidered sandals, and expressions of affected boredom. They've all arrived early to show they're important, and they've all had at least one drink to show they're relaxed. You mentally recalibrate the wine rations. A slave offers perfumed towels. Another presents rosewater. One guest refuses both and instead demands a small amphora of something more Dionysian. You give him spiced wine. He calls it intellectual. You don't correct him. The garden fills with murmurs, introductions, judgments, hushed conversations that are somehow louder than actual conversation. Someone's already asked where the flute girls are. Someone else is eyeing the fruit pile like it owes them money. You keep moving, nodding, adjusting. You separate 2 senators who haven't spoken since the goat insult incident. You notice that Governor Crispus is reclining far too close to someone else's wife, and that the poets are gathering in a corner like storm clouds. One of the dancers strays too early into the center. You snap your fingers. Not yet. Timing matters. If everything begins too soon, it loses mystery. If it begins too late, guests complain. You want suspense. You want a smoldering scandal. You pass a serving tray, discreetly pluck a grape, and keep walking. You spot one guest already snoring on a cushion, another polishing a dagger with butter. So yes, it's going well. For a Roman orgy, controlled chaos is the highest compliment. And tonight you're almost insulted. The lyres are tuned. The flute girls are finally sober, or at least balanced, and the dancers are oiling their limbs like they're about to go into battle. You give the nod. The entertainment begins. A hush falls over the triclinium as the first dancer steps forward, golden veils flowing, anklets chiming, eyes fixed somewhere between divine inspiration and complete apathy. She begins to move. It's graceful, hypnotic, and exactly the level of theatrical sensuality that makes elderly senators feel poetic. The flute joins in slow, spiraling notes that float through the perfumed air like incense. For a brief, beautiful moment, the entire feast slips into rhythm. Chewing slows. Conversations hush. Even the poet stops trying to recite. But then, of course, something goes off script. A guest demands a reenactment of the myth of Leda and the Swan. Another counter. No Orpheus in the underworld, with real torches this time. A third suggests something involving naked gladiators, a water jug, and interpretive juggling. You smile politely and assure them it's all part of the plan. Meanwhile, the mime twins, who were specifically told to wait until the third wine course, enter early and begin miming an exaggerated scene of seduction involving a fig and a sausage. Half the room laughs. The other half looks confused. One man applauds like it's the theater of Pompey. You resist the urge to pour wine directly into your eyes. The dancers continue. The musicians try to adapt. You spot the harpist improvising something mournful, possibly because she's just realized she's playing in a wrong key. Then someone throws a peach. At first it seems accidental, but then another guest throws a fig back. Now it's participatory. You step in quickly, raise your hand, and declare it a symbolic offering to Bacchus. Everyone cheers. Crisis averted. You make a note to never serve throwable fruit. The entertainment surges forward. Music, movement, whispers, laughter. A flame dancer performs near the pool. A flute girl stumbles. A guest proposes to a statue. It's chaos. Gorgeous, perfumed, theatrical chaos. And this is where you shine. Orgy planner, stage manager, mood wrangler, fig diplomat. You adjust a lamp, nod to a server, and glide silently through the shadows, as if any of this was intentional. By the third course, the wine is no longer being served, it's being worshipped. The guests draped across their couches like tipsy gods are in full bloom, laughing too loudly, flirting too boldly, and forgetting basic facts like who they came with. You've instructed the servers to strategically dilute the wine. Falernian is strong. One amphora can convince a senator to sing poetry or confess to tax fraud. You water down the wine for the ambitious and leave it pure for the already hopeless. It's diplomacy by the jug. The conversations grow less philosophical, more personal. A young patrician loudly compares his wealth to Jupiter's. A merchant brags about owning 3 villas and a camel. A woman in pearls whispers a joke about the emperor's feet. You pretend not to hear. If she gets exiled, you'll miss her. She's great with seating arrangements. Across the hall, a poet is trying to seduce a philosopher using verse that sounds suspiciously plagiarized. You walk past just in time to hear your eyes are like olives. Dark and briny. You do not enter. Meanwhile, 2 courtesans are locked in a passive-aggressive compliment battle. Each smile is a dagger. Each laugh carries the scent of strategic murder. One gives the other a fig. You take a mental note. Remove all figs by dessert. And of course, in the back corner, someone has decided to start a drinking game involving gladiator trivia. Name 3 famous jewels or drink. Someone shouts. A minor senator tries to fake his way through an answer. He's booed. He drinks. He collapses gently into a pillow and begins quoting Virgil in the garden. The guest is giving a speech. He believes he's being profound. He's actually just explaining how many slaves it takes to keep a marble fountain clean. No one stops him. It's tradition. The wine flows faster now. Amphorae are open like promises. Cups are never empty. Boundaries blur. Names are forgotten. Stories are exaggerated. The orgy part of the orgy is inching closer, and still you monitor the flow like a seasoned general. You adjust lighting. You slow the music. You stop a guest from drinking perfume. The orgy is heating up, and the scandals. They're just beginning to simmer. By this point in the evening, the party has transitioned from structured decadence to unstructured mythological nonsense. Guests have stopped using names. Titled senators are referring to each other as Apollo, Venus, or that guy with the peacocks. Someone has fashioned a laurel wreath out of table herbs. You spot 3 people in the fountain. One appears to be trying to baptize the others. You decide not to ask. This is the moment where most hosts would panic. But you sip watered wine calmly and begin quiet damage control. The gladiator wrestling reenactment has moved dangerously close to the mosaic of Neptune. You reroute them gently, offering a tray of dates as distraction. It works. They fall for it like toddlers with tattoos. You notice 2 guests missing. You find them under the table, arguing about stoicism while rubbing each other's feet. You cough discreetly. They nod and pretend to be looking for a lost bracelet in the west alcove. The flute girl has burst into tears. A guest asked if her instrument was tuned, which she interpreted as a metaphor for something else entirely. You send over the backup lyre player a complimentary handful of pomegranate seeds. She recovers. In the atrium, a very large man is attempting to seduce a marble bust of Venus. He's whispering sweet nothings and slowly feeding it olives. You send a servant to gently turn the bust away to avoid scandal. The man takes it as a challenge and begins reciting love poetry. You allow it. Frankly, it's better than his earlier conversation about grain tariffs. Someone knocks over a torch. You catch it before it hits the tapestry. You do not flinch. You do not sweat. You are still the center in a storm of satin, grapes, and moral compromise. You walk the room like a high priest of excess, adjusting, smoothing, redirecting. A hand on his shoulder, a look across the room, a raised brow that says, "Don't throw that goblet, Cassius." He puts it down. He knows better. This is your art, your chaos, and you've tamed it just enough. But it's not over yet. You hear the distinct sound of someone riding a wine cart down the hallway. You take another sip. It's almost dawn. Dawn breaks with all the subtlety of a dropped amphora. Sunlight creeps across the marble floors, illuminating the carnage. Overturned goblets, a sandal stuck in a fruit bowl, and a nobleman sleeping face down in a decorative urn. The oil lamps are sputtering out. The perfume has faded into something resembling regret. You step carefully over a passed-out flute player and begin your final round of damage assessment. The cushions are askew. Several togas are draped across statues in ways that could qualify as art or evidence. Someone wrote a philosophical limerick on the wall in wine. It doesn't rhyme, but it is surprisingly insightful. You find your way to the triclinium. A pile of olives has been arranged into a crude likeness of the emperor. You consider preserving it, then quietly kick it under the table. The slaves begin the silent ritual of post-orgy cleanup. Wine-stained linens are bundled up. Half-eaten peacocks are carted off. Incense ash is swept into neat, dignified piles. You give instructions in a hushed voice as though speaking too loudly might awaken the deeper chaos. You check on the guest list. Everyone accounted for no deaths, 1 sprained ankle, 2 spontaneous marriages, 1 very polite note left by a departing philosopher that simply reads, "Thank you. I've learned things I must never speak of." You make a list titled Debrief. It includes never serving throwable fruit. Do not allow live poetry battles near open flames. Keep Venus statue in storage during future events. Seat Crispus far from anyone with legal representation. Someone groans loudly from under a table. You nod in acknowledgement but offer no help. The party is over. Everyone must face their own consequences. In the garden, doves are still wandering from the pigburst performance. You gently herd them into a corner and throw them some leftover candied almonds. They deserve something sweet after the evening they've endured. You take one last look around. It was a mess, a triumph, a diplomatic nightmare with grapes, and you survived it. You retire to your room, kick off your sandals, and collapse onto your mat. No applause, no awards, just the knowledge that no one saw the chaos because you absorbed it. Tomorrow they'll tell stories about how perfect it was. You'll just sleep, uttered with a whisper of wind, dry, crackling bitter. The soil of the Great Plains, once black and rich, had turned to powder, and now that powder took flight. Farmers who once danced in golden wheat fields stood helpless as their land. Their future quite literally blew away. The 1930s weren't kind to anyone, but for families from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and eastern Colorado, the land itself became the enemy. They had trusted the soil. That was the tragedy. Encouraged by government incentives and promises of prosperity, thousands of families had plowed up native grasses to make way for row after row of wheat. But they weren't told that those native grasses were the only thing holding the land in place. And when the rain stopped in 1931, they didn't return. Year after year, the drought deepened. Without roots, the topsoil had nothing to hold it down. It began to lift, carried away by the wind and ever-thickening clouds. The storms came suddenly. One moment the sky was blue, the next it was black. As if night had fallen in the middle of the day, walls of dust hundreds of feet high swallowed entire towns. Livestock suffocated. Cars stalled. Children developed dust pneumonia. Mothers sealed windows with wet towels and stuffed newspaper into the cracks of doors. But the dust still crept in, coating dishes and furniture lungs. People started calling it the Dust Bowl on April 14, 1935. Forever known as Black Sunday, a storm so massive swept across the plains that some believed the world was ending. A preacher in Oklahoma reportedly told his congregation to go home and prepare for judgment. That storm stretched for over 200 miles, blotted out the sun, and turned the day to darkness for thousands. And with it came a realization. They couldn't stay. The soil was gone. The crops were gone. The livestock were dying. Children were coughing up dirt. What was once a land of hope had become a graveyard of dreams. And so, with battered pickup trucks, jellops held together with wire, and everything they owned strapped to the roof, families turned toward California, toward survival, toward anything better than this. They didn't yet know what waited for them on the other side, but they knew what they were running from. And it was gaining on them. The road W wasn't paved with gold. It was paved with desperation. As the Dust Bowl ravaged the plains, an exodus unlike any other in American history began. Families piled into rickety Fords and Chevrolets, often with 4 flat tires and more children than seats. Everything they had, mattresses, kettles, washboards, and heirlooms, was lashed down with rope. Their destination was a dream. California Route 66 became the artery of escape. It stretched from the Dust Bowl states to the Pacific, winding through New Mexico, Arizona, and into California's Central Valley. For many, it wasn't just a road. It was a lifeline. Towns along the route swelled with migrants. Camps sprang up near gas stations, and any rest stop with running water became a temporary home. They came by the thousands, an estimated 2.5 million people. Fled the southern plains during the 1930s. Most were small-time farmers, sharecroppers, and field hands. They left behind mortgages they couldn't pay, fields they couldn't save, and homes they could no longer live in. Many never looked back. Others wept as they crossed the state line. But California wasn't the promised land they had imagined. Newspaper ads had promised farm jobs and lush fields, but the reality was far harsher. By the time most migrants arrived, the Great Depression had already choked off much of the economy. Work was scarce and wages were lower than survival required. At the state border, California Highway Patrol officers began turning people away if they looked too poor, derogatorily nicknamed Okies. Regardless of whether they were actually from Oklahoma, these migrants were viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. Locals feared they'd bring crime, disease, or worse, competition for scarce jobs. Still, the travelers pressed on in makeshift camps called Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, whom many blamed for their plight. They slept under tarps and cardboard. In the fields, they picked peaches, grapes, cotton, whatever was in season. Their children worked beside them, often in the blazing heat. A day's pay might buy a little bread, maybe beans. And yet, even through hunger and humiliation, they carried hope. Hope that the next field would pay better, that California would eventually deliver on its dream, that the road, however long and dusty, led somewhere better, because to turn back wasn't just impossible. It meant surrender. And none of them were ready to do that. Once in California, the dust didn't follow them, but the hardship did. For the thousands of families who arrived seeking a better life, What they found instead were crowded, unsanitary migrant camps and a cold welcome from the locals. Entire communities of tents, shacks, and makeshift huts sprang up on the outskirts of towns and orchards. These were not homes. They were survival zones. Families crammed into shelters made from salvaged wood, tin scraps, cardboard, and canvas. There was little privacy. Water came from communal pumps. Toilets were often nothing more than dugout pits shared by dozens. Illness spreads fast. Malnutrition weakened the old and the young. Babies cried for milk. Parents prayed for work. The air might have been cleaner than Oklahoma's, but the mood was still suffocating. Tensions simmered. Local Californians saw the migrants as a threat. They feared that the flood of desperate laborers would undercut wages, and they were right. Growers could now offer pennies for backbreaking field work, knowing that someone, somewhere, would be desperate enough to take it. And so wages plummeted. Conditions worsened. Exploitation became the norm. Sometimes the migrants' only refuge came from the federal government. The Farm Security Administration, FSA, created a handful of labor camps like the one in Arvin, California, offering sanitation, medical care, and basic dignity. These government camps were different, organized, and clean. Even Democratic residents elected committees and settled disputes internally. But there weren't enough of them. Most families lived outside this safety net, in the informal, lawless settlements that ringed the agricultural valleys. They were often harassed by police, driven out of towns by angry mobs, or forced to keep moving to avoid detection. Local authorities labeled them vagrants. Some children were denied schooling. Others were too sick or too busy working in the fields to attend. And yet inside these camps, a culture of resilience grew. People played guitars around campfires. They told stories. They shared food. They sang. Songs like Hard Travelin' and Do Re Mi gave voice to their pain and to perseverance. These weren't just sad ballads. They were anthems of survival, because even when life stripped them of land, home, and security, they still clung to community, and with community came strength. They were poor, but they were not broken. And slowly, something powerful began to grow amid hunger, solidarity. For the children of Dust Bowl migrants, childhood was not a time of play. It was a daily exercise in endurance. Their toys were often sticks, their games played in dirt lots beside roadside camps, and their classrooms were fields of crops. The Great Depression had already strained America's youth, but for these children, poverty came with an extra layer of dust and displacement. They weren't shielded from the struggle. They were part of it. Even young children worked alongside their parents, stooping to pick cotton, grapes, or beans for a few cents a day. Some were as young as 6, their small fingers blistered and raw by the end of each shift. School was a luxury. Constant relocation meant constant interruption. By the time they enrolled in a new school, it was time to move again. And if they made it to school at all, they were often unwelcome. Labeled Okie kids, they were mocked by peers and sometimes even by teachers. Their clothing patched, sun-bleached, and often shared between siblings marked them instantly. Their accents, their dust-bitten skin, their silence born of hunger, they all set them apart. Some schools refused to enroll them altogether. Others required them to clean toilets before attending class. Yet amid the adversity, these children developed an uncommon grit. They learned to care for younger siblings while their parents worked. They carried jugs of water to the fields, fixed broken shoes with scraps of rubber, and helped stretch meals made of beans, cornmeal, and lard. Despite the odds, there were small triumphs. Relief agencies occasionally provided books, soap, and even makeshift schools. In the rare government camps with stability, children could laugh, read, and learn, if only for a little while. It wasn't much, but for a child who had lived through dust storms, hunger, and homelessness, it was a start. Some grew up to remember these years not just as ones of deprivation, but of togetherness. Families, though poor, were tightly knit. Storytelling, music, and shared chores created bonds that lasted lifetimes. The children might not have had toys or birthdays or summer vacations, but they had one another. And as they grew, many carried that resilience into adulthood, becoming the first in their families to find stable jobs, finish high school, or join the military in the coming war. They were children of dust, yes, but also children of determination. As the Dust Bowl migrants toiled in California's fields and camps, their stories didn't vanish. They transformed into songs. Music became both a comfort and a weapon, a way to preserve dignity and protest injustice when words alone weren't enough. In the rhythm of guitar strings and the verses of folk ballads, the pain, pride, and perseverance of the migrants came alive. Nowhere was this more visible than in the music of Woody Guthrie. A native Oklahoman himself, Guthrie became the voice of the displaced. He traveled alongside migrants, slept in the same camps, and picked in the same fields. What he saw, he sang. His songs weren't abstract. They named real places, real struggles, real heartbreak. Do Re Mi, for example, warned hopeful migrants that California wasn't the paradise they had imagined. California is a Garden of Eden, a paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the dough, Re Mi. Guthrie's songs echoed through dusty camps, played on battered guitars and harmonicas, or simply sung aloud. They were passed from tent to tent, worker to worker. These weren't just melodies, they were oral history. They reminded listeners they weren't alone. They turned shared pain into collective strength. But Guthrie wasn't the only one. Across the camps, migrants created their own songs. About lost farms, cruel foremen, the long road west, or hopes for a better tomorrow. These songs told the truth when newspapers didn't, when politicians wouldn't. They spoke of exploitation, hunger, police harassment, and broken dreams, but also of love, faith, and resistance. This music influenced the rising American folk scene and became part of a larger cultural shift. It exposed listeners beyond California to the harsh reality of life for Dust Bowl refugees. It built empathy. It planted seeds of activism. Over time, these songs helped fuel support for reform. They humanized statistics. They pierced through indifference. They challenged the narrative that the migrants were lazy or unwanted. In melody, they proved otherwise. Because when the land failed, and the work was cruel, and the people were hostile, there was still the music. It fed souls when bodies starved. It gave voice to the voiceless, and it reminded every man, woman, and child beneath the canvas roof. You matter, you belong, you endure. The migrants had their songs, but they also found a voice in literature, one that would echo far beyond the camps and fields. That voice belonged to John Steinbeck, a California native who witnessed the Dust Bowl migration firsthand and transformed the plight of the displaced into one of the most powerful novels in American history, The Grapes of Wrath. Published in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath followed the fictional Joad family, Okies from Oklahoma, as they made the harrowing journey west and encountered the brutal realities of migrant life. But while the characters were fictional, their suffering was very real. Steinbeck had traveled through migrant camps, spoken with families, and documented their lives in searing detail. He was outraged by what he saw: malnutrition, police violence, wage theft, and the erosion of human dignity. His words were not gentle. They were raw, furious, and unflinching. He described babies starving to death, men breaking under humiliation, women doing back-breaking labor while hiding pregnancies. Steinbeck didn't romanticize the poor. He honored them. He saw in them a resilience that refused to die. The novel sparked a firestorm. Some called it un-American. Growers and local officials denounced Steinbeck, accusing him of exaggeration and slander. One California Chamber of Commerce even burned copies of the book, but readers across the country couldn't look away. Suddenly, the faceless Okies had names, stories, and beating hearts. Steinbeck's work did more than raise awareness. It pushed for action. His reporting, combined with the influence of The Grapes of Wrath, helped pressure the federal government to investigate labor abuses and improve conditions for migrants. It brought national attention to a crisis many preferred to ignore, and just as important, it preserved a record. Long after the camps vanished and the wind settled, Steinbeck's story remained. For the children and grandchildren of the Dust Bowl migrants, it became a touchstone, a proof that what their families endured mattered, that their struggle had been seen. In a time when the poor were expected to suffer silently, The Grapes of Wrath shouted. It demanded that the nation listen, and many did. Because sometimes the most powerful form of resistance isn't a protest sign or a song. It's a story, and Steinbeck told it like no one else could. As the Dust Bowl migrants flooded into California, and the American public began to grasp the scale of the disaster, the federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, was forced to act. The suffering was simply too visible to ignore. Children were starving, camps were overflowing, fields were filled with desperate laborers, and America's image of itself as the land of opportunity was unraveling in real time. Enter the New Deal, Roosevelt's sweeping series of programs designed to rescue the country from the Great Depression. While the New Deal didn't solve every problem migrants faced, it marked a turning point. Agencies like the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration, FSA, were created to offer aid, restore dignity, and attempt long-term solutions. The FSA in particular focused on the plight of displaced rural families. It built government-run labor camps in California and other states, structured communities with clean water, toilets, medical care, schools, and even playgrounds. These camps weren't luxurious, but to families who had slept in ditches and roadside tents, they were sanctuaries. Residents elected their own leaders and handled disputes internally, creating some of the only democratic spaces these families had ever known. The camps also became cultural havens. There were libraries, music events, even classes in English and farming. For many, they were places where a new kind of rural American identity began to take shape, one that valued self-governance, solidarity, and pride. Outside the camps, the New Deal offered jobs through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, although these were often hard to access for transient migrants. But one of the most lasting contributions came not in dollars, but in documentation. Under the FSA's direction, a team of photographers, including Dorothea Lange, was sent to capture the human cost of the crisis. Her haunting photo, Migrant Mother, became an instant symbol of Dust Bowl era's suffering. It gave the faceless a face. It gave the ignored a voice. Still, not all relief efforts reached everyone. Red tape and local resistance often excluded the very people who needed help the most. Yet for many families, the New Deal wasn't just a policy. It was a lifeline. It was proof that the government at last was trying to listen. And for once, help came before it was too late. By the late 1930s, many Dust Bowl migrants were no longer just surviving. They were organizing. Years of exploitation, broken promises, and dehumanizing labor conditions had pushed them to a tipping point. What began as quiet grumbling in the fields grew into a movement. A wave of strikes, boycotts, and labor protests swept through California's agricultural valleys as migrants demanded better wages, safer conditions, and basic human dignity. It was a dangerous gamble. Growers were powerful. They had money, political connections, and the police on their side. Striking workers were often arrested, beaten, or run out of town. Some were blacklisted from future employment. Others were attacked by hired enforcers. But despite the risks, the workers stood their ground. Organizations like the Cannery and Agricultural Workers Industrial Union and the United Cannery, Agricultural Packing, and Allied Workers of America, UCAPAWA, began to emerge, offering a rare but essential support system. Though often underfunded and fragmented, these unions helped teach workers how to negotiate, how to protest peacefully, and how to document abuses. For many migrants, especially women, joining a strike wasn't just about money. It was about voice. Mothers marched with children in their arms. Teenage daughters stood beside fathers in picket lines in some camps. Entire families were evicted for trying to unionize. Yet the courage remained. In 1933 and 1934, massive cotton strikes broke out across the San Joaquin Valley. Thousands walked off the job. While growers tried to break the momentum with intimidation and violence, the strike gained national attention. And after long weeks of protest, workers won a modest pay increase, proof that resistance could work. Journalists and writers documented these uprisings. Photographers captured images of tired but defiant picketers. Labor organizers like Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta, though their most famous work would come later, stood on the shoulders of these early migrant movements. The Dust Bowl refugees weren't just poor, desperate people. They were political actors, survivors, and fighters. Even as their accents marked them as outsiders and their clothes betrayed their poverty, they refused to be silenced. They were no longer just victims of weather and economics. They were now shaping the narrative. In standing up for themselves, they began to change not just their own lives, but the future of labor in America. And their fight was just beginning. By the early 1940s, the worst of the Dust Bowl had passed. Rain finally returned to the plains. The economy, bolstered by the demands of World War II, began to recover. Many migrant families who had once wandered from field to field found permanent homes, steady work, and a fragile sense of normalcy. But the migration had already left a deep, irreversible mark on American society, culturally, politically, and emotionally. The children who once picked fruit under a blazing sun grew up to serve in the military, attend college through the GI Bill, and raise families of their own. Some became farmers again, this time with greater respect for conservation in the land. Others moved to cities like Los Angeles and Bakersfield, laying the foundation for working-class neighborhoods that still exist today. Culturally, the Dust Bowl migration reshaped California. Once seen as outsiders, Okies gradually became part of the fabric of the state. Their music, language, and values blended with local traditions, giving rise to new genres, like the Bakersfield sound in country music made famous by artists like Merle Haggard, himself the son of migrants. The pain and pride of those years never vanished. They just found new ways to speak. In literature, The Grapes of Wrath became a permanent fixture on American bookshelves, a reminder of both the nation's cruelty and its capacity for compassion. In politics, the Dust Bowl era helped fuel the labor rights movement, land conservation efforts, and broader awareness of the need for a social safety net. The lessons weren't just historical, they were environmental. The Dust Bowl taught America the danger of abusing the land. Soil conservation districts were established, farming techniques were reformed, and ecological stewardship became a national conversation. The wounds left by reckless agriculture were deep, but not forgotten. And perhaps the most enduring legacy was that of resilience. These migrants had faced nature's wrath, economic collapse, hunger, and pain. They had been spat on, shut out, and shoved aside. But they endured, they adapted, and they helped build the modern West. Today, descendants of Dust Bowl migrants still carry the stories of hardship and grit in dusty family albums and old camp photos. In the chords of a Guthrie song, they remember because the Dust Bowl wasn't just a disaster, it was a defining chapter of American identity. One written in dust, yes, but also in determination. Imagine a world with no paper, no books, no Google, just memory and voice. That was the reality for nearly all human societies for most of our existence, long before alphabets were carved into stone or ink flowed onto parchment. Knowledge was preserved in stories, songs, and spoken rituals. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of sharing information. It was the primary engine of civilization itself. In these societies, memory was a sacred duty. Stories weren't told for entertainment alone. They were the vessels of identity, law, morality, and survival. Elders passed on creation myths, ancestral lineages, laws, customs, and taboos. Farmers learned planting cycles from seasonal chants. Hunters remembered terrain through rhythmic recitations. Parents taught children life lessons through fables and parables. Everything essential, who we are, where we come from, how to live was carried in the voice because there was no written backup. Accuracy mattered. Oral cultures developed sophisticated memory techniques to preserve knowledge. Rhythm, rhyme, meter, repetition. These weren't stylistic choices. They were mnemonic devices. Stories had structure for a reason. Chants and epics were designed to be unforgettable, and they had to be. In a world where the past lived only in minds and mouths, forgetting wasn't just a lapse, it was a cultural crisis. But oral tradition was never static. It was flexible, responsive. Each retelling carried a pulse of the present. A storyteller might adjust a tale for a new audience or shift emphasis depending on context. This made oral knowledge both enduring and adaptable. A living, breathing archive. It wasn't stored on dusty shelves. It walked, talked, danced, and sang. Storytellers themselves held immense social power. In many cultures, they were revered. They weren't just performers. They were memory keepers, truth bearers. In some places, they were spiritual guides or political advisors. In others, they held the sole responsibility for preserving centuries of wisdom. Losing a master storyteller could mean losing a nation's history. In the absence of written words, societies didn't descend into ignorance. They found other ways to thrive. Oral tradition ensured continuity across generations. It stitched time together. It connected the dead to the living, the individual to the community, the past to the future. And in many corners of the world, it still does. In the heart of West Africa, history walks and talks. It sings, it remembers. It lives in the voice of the griot, a figure who is at once historian, storyteller, musician, genealogist, diplomat, and spiritual guide. In societies stretching from Mali to Senegal to Guinea, griots have preserved centuries of memory without ever writing a single word. The role of the griot isn't just cultural, it's essential. For the Mande peoples and others, griots are keepers of oral archives, entrusted with a collective knowledge of clans, lineages, and empires. They know who married who fought which war, what treaties were signed, and what legends lie behind every village name. A griot can recount a genealogy that spans dozens of generations, recited without hesitation. This isn't casual storytelling. Griots undergo years, sometimes decades, of intense apprenticeship. From a young age, they are trained to memorize thousands of lines of verse, master complex melodies on traditional instruments like the kora, and understand the historical, political, and spiritual weight behind each word. Knowledge is passed down orally from master to apprentice, generation to generation. Griots often serve at royal courts, advising kings and chiefs. When a ruler makes a major decision whether to go to war, marry into a rival clan, or forge an alliance, it's the griot who offers historical precedent, reminding leaders of past mistakes or ancient promises. In this sense, griots are not only entertainers, but moral anchors. Their role helps ensure continuity, legitimacy, and wisdom in leadership. Even today, in the digital age, griots remain influential. They perform at weddings, funerals, naming ceremonies, and national events. Their stories remind communities of who they are and what they've overcome. Griots hold power through voice, an ability to preserve unity and identity across centuries of change. When colonialism threatened to erase African history by disregarding oral sources, griots stood as a living rebuke. They proved that memory could endure outside of paper, and that oral tradition was not primitive but profound. In fact, much of what we know today about empires like Mali or Songhai comes not from colonial records, but from griots who never stopped singing. They are walking libraries, living time machines, and without them, vast stretches of African history would have vanished. Thousands of years before compasses or GPS, the peoples of the Pacific Ocean were already master navigators. From tiny canoes, they charted one of the largest expanses of water on Earth, sailing from island to island across thousands of miles. They had no maps, no written instructions. Instead, they had oral tradition, a deep, embodied knowledge passed from one generation to the next, preserved not in books, but in the blood and bones of memory. At the heart of this tradition were the wayfinders, highly trained navigators who used the stars, ocean swells, cloud formations, bird flight patterns, and even the color of the water to find their way. This knowledge wasn't guesswork. It was precise, tested over generations of voyaging. But it wasn't written down. It was memorized through chants, songs, and visualizations taught over many years in sacred training. One of the most famous examples of this oral memory system is the star compass used by Polynesian navigators. This mental map divided the horizon into specific points aligned with the rising and setting of stars. Each star had meaning, direction, and seasonal timing. Wayfinders would chant these stars in a sequence, imprinting entire navigational routes into their minds like a living GPS. The knowledge didn't stop with astronomy. Navigators memorized sequences of islands, stories of past voyages, ocean swells, seasonal winds, and oral genealogies of their own lineages. Because navigation wasn't just about travel, it was about identity. To To sail the ocean was to trace the steps of your ancestors, to renew your connection to them with every voyage. Oral tradition also safeguarded cultural history. Myths of great migrations, origin stories, and the deeds of legendary seafarers were recited with reverence. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were survival manuals. They told when and where to travel, where fresh water could be found, what reefs to avoid, and what omens to heed. When European explorers arrived in the Pacific, they marveled at the accuracy of these navigators. Some dismissed their knowledge as luck or instinct, but centuries later, modern researchers began to rediscover the immense cognitive sophistication behind it. Today, Polynesian voyaging societies are reviving these oral traditions, training new generations in the art of wayfinding without technology. Because in Polynesia, to remember is to navigate, to speak is to sail, and to forget is to be lost at sea. Long before the written word carved its place in Greek culture, bards traveled from town to town, reciting epic tales that would define Western literature. Among these storytellers was a name that echoed through millennia: Homer. Whether he was a single historical figure or a composite of many voices, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are towering testaments to the power of oral tradition. These weren't simply stories, they were living performances. Recited aloud, often accompanied by the lyre, Homeric epics were transmitted from bard to bard, memorized in their entirety. The Iliad alone contains over 15,000 lines of verse. How could one possibly remember it all? The answer lies in the architecture of oral composition, formulaic language, repetition, epithets like rosy-fingered Dawn or swift-footed Achilles. These repeated phrases weren't just poetic flourishes. They were memory aids, cues embedded in the narrative to help the performer stay on track. This method of oral composition allowed for flexibility. No recitations were ever exactly the same. A bard could expand or shorten the story depending on the audience, weaving in local heroes or emphasizing different emotional beats. In this way, oral tradition allowed the epics to remain relevant, reshaped by each generation, even as their core remained intact. Homeric epics were more than entertainment. They were moral instruction, historical memory, and collective identity. Through the stories of Troy and Odysseus, Greek audiences absorbed lessons on honor, loyalty, cunning, fate, and the will of the gods. The performances bound communities together, reinforcing shared values and reminding listeners of their place in the tapestry of myth and memory, even after the invention of writing. Homer's works continue to be performed aloud for centuries. The Greeks eventually committed the epics to text, but by then they had already left their imprint on Greek thought, education, and religion. They became cornerstones of classical learning, recited in schools and echoed in the works of philosophers and playwrights. The survival of Homer's tales is a triumph for the oral world. They weren't etched in stone, yet they endured longer than many civilizations. They remind us that human memory, when nurtured and structured, can rival the permanence of books. Because in ancient Greece, to recite Homer wasn't just to tell a story, it was to hold history in your breath. Long before European contact, the indigenous peoples of North America had built rich, complex civilizations without the use of written language. Their histories, laws, cosmologies, and scientific knowledge were preserved entirely through oral tradition. For these communities, spoken word was not merely a method of communication. It was a sacred force. Stories were not just told. They were shared, passed like ceremonial objects, with reverence and responsibility. Each nation, whether the Haudenosaunee, Lakota, Navajo, or Hopi, had its own oral system suited to its landscape, cosmology, and social structure. Creation stories explain not just how the world began, but how humans were meant to live within it. Animal fables taught values like respect, courage, and humility. Historical narratives preserved records of migration, warfare, treaties, and contact with outsiders. These stories were often told during winter, when families gathered in longhouses or around fire circles, reinforcing identity and kinship. The storytellers, often elders or spiritual leaders, were chosen not just for their memory, but for their integrity. They had to be exact. Embellishment wasn't encouraged unless it served a ritual purpose. Many stories had strict patterns, sacred sequences, and proper openings. The story mistold wasn't just inaccurate, it was disrespectful. Beyond history and myth, oral tradition also preserved practical knowledge. Indigenous fire ecology, agricultural systems, astronomical tracking, and herbal medicine were passed orally across centuries. The knowledge of when to plant, where to hunt, how to interpret the stars, or what plants healed wounds. This wasn't written in manuals. It was spoken from elder to youth, often in the form of story, song, or ceremony. Even diplomacy was rooted in oral memory. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, relied on oral recitation of its great law of peace, an epic constitution preserved through wampum belts and ceremonial speech, not parchment. When European colonists arrived, they often dismissed oral culture as inferior, not realizing they were speaking to societies with deep intellectual and legal traditions. In many communities today, that spoken word survives, despite centuries of forced assimilation and cultural erasure. Indigenous elders still pass on songs, names, and wisdom. Some tribes are revitalizing endangered languages by reviving storytelling ceremonies, knowing that when language dies, stories die too. But as long as a voice remains, memory survives, and through it, nations endure. Long before holy books were bound in leather and placed on altars, the sacred moved through speech. In nearly every major religious tradition, the earliest teachings were carried not on scrolls, but in the human voice, recited, memorized, and preserved by devoted followers. Oral tradition wasn't just a method of communication in these faiths. It was the very vehicle of revelation. Take Hinduism, one of the oldest continuous religions on earth. The Vedas, Hinduism's foundational texts, were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. Sanskrit priests known as pundits or Brahmins were trained from childhood to memorize vast volumes of text down to every syllable and intonation. The Vedas weren't just words, they were sounds believed to hold cosmic power. Accuracy was essential. Mispronunciation could distort the spiritual effect, and so oral recitation was treated with precision, rhythm, and reverence in Islam. The Quran is considered by believers to be the literal word of God, as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Not written, but recited. Even today, millions of Muslims memorize the Quran in its entirety, a practice known as becoming a Hafiz. The oral tradition here isn't a supplement to the text, it's central. The melodic cadence of Quranic recitation, passed from teacher to student, sustains spiritual meaning and connects the listener to centuries of unbroken transmission. Christianity also began as an oral tradition. The stories of Jesus, the parables, the early miracles, they were shared aloud in gatherings before the Gospels were ever written. Early Christian preachers traveled from village to village, speaking to crowds, debating, converting. Even after the New Testament was compiled, most congregants couldn't read. Faith was still heard, not read. Psalms were sung, sermons were preached. Scripture lived in ears before eyes. In Judaism, oral tradition forms the backbone of rabbinic teaching. The Mishnah and Talmud, key texts of Jewish law and interpretation, were initially preserved through complex oral chains of transmission. Rabbis debated and discussed teachings aloud, often committing thousands of lines to memory before anything was committed to ink. Across faiths, oral tradition ensured that the divine remained living, dynamic, spoken, and sung. Even today, believers continue these practices. Scripture is chanted, prayers are recited, mantras are whispered. Because for the faithful, the sacred isn't just what's written, it's what's heard, it's what's remembered, and it lives in the human breath. Long before modern courtrooms and printed legal codes, communities across the world upheld complex systems of law through oral tradition. Justice wasn't dispensed by reading from a book. It was spoken, memorized, and performed. In these societies, legal knowledge was a living memory, carried by elders, chiefs, judges, and councils who ensured that fairness, obligation, and punishment were remembered and respected. Among the Gaelic Browns of Ireland, justice was entirely oral for centuries. The Brown Laws, a detailed and intricate set of legal principles governing everything from land disputes to honor debts, were transmitted by trained legal scholars who memorized thousands of verses and precedents. These judges didn't carry books. They carried legacy. They recited decisions with precise language, referencing past judgments, and using poetic form to aid memory and preserve consistency. In sub-Saharan Africa, many societies relied on elders and councils to enact justice through oral systems in the Igbo, Zulu, or Ashanti traditions. Legal matters were resolved in public gatherings where testimony was spoken, witnesses recounted events, and judgments were issued through consensus. The absence of writing didn't mean a lack of structure. Memory was the law, elders were the archives, and the spoken word held full authority. Similarly, indigenous communities in North America used oral justice systems to resolve conflict and maintain harmony. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy relied on condolence ceremonies and consensus-based decision-making guided by the Great Law of Peace. A constitution transmitted orally and reinforced through wampum belts, beaded mnemonic tools. Laws were often embedded in stories, myths, and metaphors, reinforcing values like reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. These oral systems were not rigid. They were adaptable. They could evolve with changing times, incorporating new realities, without needing to revise written codes. This flexibility made oral law dynamic, deeply embedded in community life, and often more restorative than punitive. When colonial powers imposed written legal systems, many oral law traditions were dismissed as primitive or inferior, but they were anything but. They were community-centered, historically informed, and designed to maintain social balance, not merely enforce state power. Today, some of these oral legal systems are being revived and honored. In places like New Zealand and Canada, traditional justice models are being integrated into formal systems, not because they're quaint, but because they work. Because in oral law, justice isn't something you read, it's something you hear, something you remember, and something your whole community understands. At the heart of every oral tradition lies a human being, the storyteller. More than just a narrator, the storyteller is a performer, a teacher, and a guardian of cultural memory. Whether standing before a royal court or sitting by a village fire, they use voice, gesture, rhythm, and emotion to transform memory into living experience. In oral societies, storytelling isn't just an act. It's an art form with structure, training, and purpose. Memory is the storyteller's greatest tool. But this isn't a memory as most people know it. Storytellers often train from childhood, absorbing tales word for word, gesture for gesture, tone for tone. They learn through apprenticeship, listening to masters for years before ever telling a story themselves. Precision matters. The wrong detail can twist a sacred myth or misrepresent a lineage. And yet, flexibility is also part of the craft. The master storyteller knows how to adjust timing, tone, or content to suit different audiences, moments, or emotional atmospheres. Across cultures, performance is central. In Japan, rakugo performers sit on stage with only a fan and a cloth, bringing entire casts of characters to life through changes in pitch, facial expression, and timing. In India, Kathakal tradition combines dance, mime, and songs to retell ancient epics like the Mahabharata. In West Africa, griots use instruments like the kora to accompany the recitations, turning history into melody. Storytelling, then, isn't static. It's theater with memory as its script. The audience is never passive. In oral cultures, storytelling is communal. Listeners gasp, laugh, and respond. They know the tales, but come to hear them again. For how they're told matters as much as what is told. A familiar myth can feel new, fresh, even revelatory, depending on the teller's skill. Importantly, storytelling is not entertainment alone. It's education, history, ritual, lore, and survival. The story may teach a child what plants are poisonous. It may encode directions across a desert or rules about kinship and taboo. Often the lesson is buried in metaphor. Understood only with maturity, the storyteller is thus a cultural cornerstone. When they speak, they echo generations. They don't just remember the past, they embody it. Because in oral tradition, memory doesn't live in books, it lives in people. And when they speak, entire civilizations speak with them. In a world ruled by screens, algorithms, and cloud storage, it might seem like oral tradition has faded into the background. But in truth, it's not dying, it's evolving. The digital age, far from erasing spoken heritage, has given it new platforms, new audiences, and new power. Memory, voice, and story are once again central, not just in ancient rituals, but in podcasts, spoken word, poetry, voice notes, and viral videos. The medium has changed, but the human impulse remains the same: to remember through voice. Social media, ironically, has brought us back to something ancient. TikTok creators tell modern parables in 60 seconds. YouTubers revive myths and folk tales for millions. Podcasts have become the new campfires where people gather through headphones instead of hearts to hear stories that move, teach, or entertain. And in many indigenous and marginalized communities, digital tools are now being used to record elders, revive languages, and archive oral history before it's lost. Technology is also empowering cultures once ignored. Smartphone recordings of grandmothers telling ancestral stories or children learning tribal songs are being shared across continents. Entire archives of oral knowledge are now stored online, searchable and shareable. What was once locked in a single storyteller's memory can now be accessed by thousands with the press of a button. Yet this raises important questions. What happens when oral tradition is frozen into a digital file? Can a recorded story carry the same energy, nuance, or spiritual weight as a live performance? Will future generations still know how to listen, respond, and feel a story in their bones, not just their ears? The digital world gives oral tradition permanence, but also detaches it from the living exchange that once defined it. A story told face-to-face carries gestures, emotion, silence, and community. It is shaped by the mood of the room, the age of the listener, the time of night. Can a story still breathe in a digital archive? The answer may lie in balance. Oral tradition doesn't have to vanish in the face of modernity. It can blend with it. Podcasts can preserve memory. Live-streamed storytelling can unite global audiences. What matters is not the format, but the intention. Because as long as people speak and others listen, oral tradition survives not as a relic, but as a living bridge between past and future. And its next chapter is being written with voice, not ink. Or, tucked deep within Egypt's western desert, beyond dunes that roll like waves and sun-bleached rocks that shimmer under a brutal sun, lies the Siwa Oasis, a place of improbable life and ancient mystery. Surrounded on all sides by arid desolation, Siwa is a mirage made of real cool freshwater springs. Groves of date palms and olive trees where there should be none. But its true claim to fame is not its beauty or its isolation. It's the divine voice that once echoed from its sands. Here, at this remote outpost near the borderlands of Egypt and Libya, stood the temple of the Oracle of Ammonius, a sacred sanctuary dedicated to one of Egypt's highest gods. Ammonius wasn't just a deity of the Nile. His influence extended across empires, merging with the sun god Ra to become Ammonius-Ura, the king of the gods. But Siwa's oracle wasn't just a religious outpost. It was a spiritual beacon, a place where men came not to worship blindly, but to ask questions of fate and receive answers. Unlike the colossal temples of Thebes or Karnak, the temple of Ammonius at Siwa was modest in size, built from limestone and mud brick. Weathered by centuries of heat and wind, its strength lay in silence and secrecy. The temple was nestled within the town's sandstone cliffs, overlooking the vast sweep of the desert. It felt less like a monument and more like a whisper from the divine, hidden, intimate, powerful. The oracle at Siwa was said to speak through the high priest in trances or ritualistic ceremonies, delivering answers from Ammonius himself. Those allowed to approach the shrine brought questions of war, succession, and identity. Not just common folk, but pharaohs and conquerors journeyed across the blistering sands, seeking a glimpse of their destiny. What made Siwa different was not just its isolation, it was its independence. Though nominally part of Egypt, the oasis existed in its own rhythm. Its inhabitants spoke a Berber dialect. Its priests were not mere tools of the state. They guarded the oracle with fierce autonomy. The desert itself was a barrier, both literal and spiritual. To reach Siwa was a test of resolve, but to hear the oracle's voice was to receive something few ever did: certainty from the gods, or so it was believed. The oracle of Ammonius at Siwa wasn't like other oracles. It didn't dwell in the bustling cities of Egypt or the rich temples of the Nile Valley. It existed in silence, surrounded by nothing but dunes and the haunting wind. This isolation gave it mystique and power. People believed that only in such stillness could the gods be heard. The rituals of the oracle were cloaked in secrecy. The high priest, acting as the mouthpiece of a moon, would retreat into the inner sanctum, where only a select few were ever permitted there, in a chamber heavy with incense and guarded by thick stone walls. He would enter a trance-like state, his voice said to carry the weight of divine wisdom. Questions were asked in hushed tones. Answers, once delivered, were obeyed without challenge. The answers themselves were often cryptic, cloaked in ambiguity, yet full of meaning. Like the Greek oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Siwa rarely spoke in direct terms. Its power lay in suggestion, in offering direction without dictating fate. But unlike Delphi, the Siwan oracle was also deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious cosmology. It wasn't merely a seer. It was a channel of a god who was also king. Pilgrims came from across North Africa and beyond, braving a merciless journey through the western desert to hear the oracle speak. Merchants, generals, tribal leaders, and even kings arrived with offerings, oil, incense, and gold, hoping for divine insight into the most difficult choices of their lives. Some came for personal counsel, others came with questions that could determine the fate of nations. The oasis itself aided the mystique. At night, the desert grew quiet and impossibly dark, the sky blanketed with stars. The wind through the date palms sounded almost like voices. Visitors would report dreams, visions, or sudden feelings of revelation after their visit. Whether by ritual or suggestion, the experience left a deep impression. But it wasn't just religious seekers who came. Political figures understood the oracle's value. To receive its blessing was to claim legitimacy, not just among locals, but across the Mediterranean world. A prophecy from Siwa could crown a king, justify a war, or forge an empire, and soon one man would test that very power, carrying with him a question no mortal had yet dared ask. Was he a god or merely a king? In 331 BCE, a young conqueror rode into the Egyptian desert with a crown on his head and a question in his heart. His name was Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. By this point, he had already defeated the Persian Empire in Egypt and had been declared a pharaoh, but titles weren't enough. Alexander sought divine affirmation, not from men, but from gods, and so he turned towards Siwa. The journey was perilous. The path from Memphis to Siwa was not marked on any clear map. It wound through scorching desert, salt flats, and shifting dunes. Greek historians wrote that Alexander and his caravan nearly lost their way, saved only by miraculous signs, ravens guiding their route, or perhaps divine serpents slithering through the sand. Others claim they were led by rainstorms, extraordinary events in such an arid land. These tales may have been embellished, but they reflect the mythic tone of the entire expedition. Why did Alexander risk so much to reach the temple? The answer lies in his ambition, not just to rule the known world, but to become more than human, like the pharaohs before him. Alexander wanted divine legitimacy. He believed, or wanted others to believe, that he was not merely the son of Philip of Macedon, but the son of Zeus Ammon, the supreme god of both the Greek and Egyptian pantheons, whose earthly voice whispered from the Siwan temple. When he arrived at the oasis, Alexander was welcomed with great honor. The priests, likely well aware of his power and political reach, received him in the temple's inner sanctum, a rare privilege. What transpired in that meeting remains a mystery. No detailed account exists, but Alexander emerged transformed. Later, when asked what the oracle had told him, he was famously vague. Some sources suggest the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Others say Alexander received a prophecy of victory and divine favor. Whatever the truth, Alexander's behavior changed. He increasingly portrayed himself as a semi-divine figure, commanding loyalty not just as a king, but as a god in human form. The desert had given him more than just an answer. It had given him myth, and myth, once claimed, could move armies, build cities, and reshape empires. The temple had spoken, and Alexander never looked back. The temple of the oracle at Siwa stood at the crossroads of cultures, not just geographically, but spiritually. Its god, Ammonius, had long reigned as one of Egypt's most powerful deities. But as Greek influence spread into Egypt, Ammonius underwent a transformation in the minds of the Mediterranean world. He was reborn as Zeus Ammon, a fusion of two supreme gods, Egyptian and Greek, united in the blazing desert of Siwa. This fusion was more than symbolic. It reflected a broader syncretism, the blending of beliefs, images, and rituals that occurred when empires collided. For the Greeks, Zeus was the king of the gods, thunder-wielding, bearded, omnipotent. Ammonius for the Egyptians was the hidden one, unseen, mysterious, the breath behind all creation. He was often depicted with a ram's horns, symbols of virility, power, and divine presence when Greeks encountered Ammonius. They recognized a familiar authority and gave him the name Zeus Ammon. At Siwa, this blended identity took on extraordinary weight. The priests there were Egyptian, trained in ancient rites, yet their fame reached the Hellenistic world. For visiting Greeks like Alexander the Great, the oracle of Zeus Ammon represented not only a divine voice, but a bridge between civilizations. If Alexander could be declared the son of Zeus Ammon, he could rule both Greeks and Egyptians with a single divine lineage. The imagery followed him. Coins minted during his reign began to show Alexander adorned with ram's horns, a direct reference to Zeus Ammon and his divine paternity. This wasn't a stylistic flourish. It was a political message. Alexander wasn't just endorsed by the gods. He was of the gods. This claim helped unify a vast empire where religion was as much a tool of rule as sword or law. Zeus Ammon's cult spread beyond Siwa. Temples were built or rebranded in his name across North Africa, Greece, and even parts of Asia. Pilgrims continued to make the trek to Siwa, drawn by the mystique of a god who was both familiar and foreign, both Greek and Egyptian. The temple had become more than a shrine. It was a cosmic junction, where empires, gods, and destinies met. In the echo of its oracle, one could hear the voice not of a single culture, but of a world in transformation. And in that transformation, Zeus Ammon reigned supreme. Unlike the towering pylons of Luxor or the sprawling avenues of Karnak, the Temple of the Oracle at Siwa was modest in scale, but monumental in meaning. Built into the limestone cliffs of the Akermi Hill, the structure blended seamlessly into its desert surroundings, almost as if it had emerged from the rock itself. But this wasn't a floor of grandeur. It was a choice. The temple's power came not from its size, but from its secrecy. Approaching the temple, pilgrims would pass through winding pathways and narrow gates, ascending toward a sanctuary carved into the hill. The complex included a forecourt, a small hall, and finally the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber where the oracle's voice was said to reside. This final space was off limits to all but the high priest and select individuals like Alexander. Its simplicity concealed its sanctity. There were no grand statues or golden shrines, only silence and the unseen presence of God. The temple's design served a purpose to disorient and humble. The tight corridors and sharp angles forced visitors to slow down, to lower their heads, to move with caution and reverence. In the desert, where vastness and exposure ruled, the temple offered enclosure and stillness. Light barely entered the sanctuary. Incense would have hung heavy in there. Echoes turned whispers into something otherworldly. Scholars believe the temple may have had roof openings or vents to carry the priest's voice into adjoining rooms, heightening the drama of the oracle's declarations. From the shadows, a god would speak, and listeners would feel awe not because of what they saw, but what they heard. The architecture wasn't just functional, it was ritualistic theater. Surrounding the temple were other structures, priest quarters, ritual pools, and sacred gardens fed by natural springs. Even in this arid land, Siwa was blessed with water, adding to the belief that the oasis itself was touched by divine hands from the sacred hill. One could see the dunes stretching endlessly, a reminder of the temple's isolation and importance. This was not a place for crowds. It was a place for pilgrims, prophets, and kings, a space designed not to impress the eyes, but to stir the soul. And in that still cloistered chamber, the future could be whispered from stone. As centuries passed and empires shifted, the Temple of the Oracle at Siwa began to fade, not in legend, but in voice. The divine breath that once stirred the desert winds grew still. By the time the Roman Empire took root in Egypt, the oracle's prominence had begun to wane. What had once been a cosmic crossroads between gods and kings was now a relic of a fading world. There was no single moment when the oracle fell silent. It was a slow unraveling. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals fought bitterly over his empire, and the political unity that had given the temple prestige dissolved. Though Zeus Ammon continued to be venerated in name, the pilgrimage to Siwa no longer held the same magnetic pull. Power shifted back to the Nile Valley, into cities like Alexandria, where philosophy and science began to replace oracular faith. The rise of Rome brought new gods, new laws, and new priorities. Roman emperors paid lip service to Egyptian cults, but the centralized bureaucratic religion of the empire left little room for the shadowy ambiguity of oracles. Shrines like Siwa's were increasingly seen as quaint remnants of a mythic past, respected but no longer consulted for matters of state. Then came Christianity. As it spread across Egypt in the early centuries CE, it cast a harsh light on the old pagan ways. By the 4th century, under the Christianized Roman Empire, temples to the ancient gods were being shut down or repurposed. Oracles were denounced as demonic or deceitful, and in this sweeping religious upheaval, the voice of Ammonius at Siwa, already a whisper, was extinguished. The temple itself fell into disrepair, its stones weathered by time and sandstorms. Priests vanished. Rituals ended. The god who once spoke to Alexander and guided kings now stood mute, buried under the sands of history. Travelers still visited, curious about its legacy, but found only silence and ruins. And yet the story didn't vanish. Siwa became a legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones by scholars and dreamers. The temple may have lost its oracle, but it had gained something else. Mystery. In silence, the temple became immortal, not in prophecy, but in memory, not in sound, but in stone. For centuries, the temple of the oracle at Siwa lay, hidden from the wider world, buried not under rubble, but under forgetfulness. The oasis remained inhabited, its people living in quiet continuity, but the once sacred temple was no longer a place of pilgrimage. Its walls weathered under relentless desert winds. Its legends, though still told among locals, had faded from global memory. That began to change in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European explorers and scholars, swept up in a wave of curiosity about ancient Egypt, turned their attention to the western desert. Siwa was difficult to reach, its isolation protected by harsh terrain and wary tribes. But in 1792, the first documented European, an Englishman named William George Brown, braved the journey. Others followed, drawn by rumors of a lost oracle visited by Alexander the Great. By the early 20th century, archaeologists and historians began surveying the ruins in earnest. The Akermi Hill complex was identified as the likely site of the Temple of Ammonius. Though modest in size, the structure matched descriptions from ancient texts: a central chamber, thick defensive walls, and its vantage point over the surrounding oasis. The temple wasn't grand, but it was exactly where history said it would be. Excavations were limited and cautious. The site had suffered erosion, but some stonework and inscriptions remained. Fragmentary as it was, the architecture spoke volumes: a stone altar, traces of columns, rooms aligned with celestial bodies. Each clue confirmed that this windswept ruin had once held the ear of kings and gods. More than archaeology, it was the mythology of Siwa that drew fascination. The idea that Alexander had stood here, alone in a desert sanctuary, hearing words that would change empires, captured the imagination of generations. Poets, historians, and travelers romanticized the journey, blending fact and legend into a timeless narrative today. Visitors still come to Siwa, not to consult an oracle, but to feel the echo of its silence. The temple, though worn, remains standing. Its stones are sun-bleached, its walls crumbling, but the air around it still hums with something ancient, something unresolved. Ruins don't need voices to speak. They speak through presence, through mystery. And in Siwa, the stones remember what the world once forgot. Though the temple no longer speaks with the voice of gods, the oasis of Siwa still breathes with life, culture, and memory. Far from being a forgotten outpost, Siwa remains a vibrant, living community, its people guardians of a heritage that stretches back millennia. The oracle may be silent, but the traditions it once inspired still ripple through the town's language, rituals, and rhythms. Siwans speak a distinct Berber dialect known as Siwi, unique in Egypt and a testament to the oasis's ancient roots. Oral storytelling remains vital, just as it did in the days of the oracle. Elders pass down myths, family histories, and local legends, blending Islamic faith with pre-Islamic customs in subtle ways. Many Sivans still recount tales of Alexander's visit, not from books, but from memory. The architecture of Siwa also preserves echoes of the past. Traditional mud brick buildings cool in the searing desert heat line the town, and the ruined fortress of Sharli, built from salt and clay, still towers over the oasis like a ghost of another age. The design of these structures reflects a continuity of form and function that has resisted change for centuries. Siwa's sacred geography remains powerful. Nearby springs and pools are still venerated. Cleopatra's Pool, a natural spring believed to have been used by the famous queen herself. It remains a popular spot for both locals and visitors. Rituals tied to fertility, harvest, and healing still occur, many layered with Islamic prayers but rooted in older traditions. Even marriage festivals, like the annual celebration at Gebel Daker, preserve elements of Siwa's spiritual past. Families gather, songs echo, and matches are made, not unlike the ancient gatherings once held in the temple, where people sought guidance not only for war and kingship, but for life itself. In the modern age, Siwa has become a quiet pilgrimage site of a different kind, not for prophecy, but for peace. Travelers seeking escape from the noise of modernity come here to walk the palm groves, soak in the desert silence, and reflect on a time when God spoke from stone. Siwa reminds us that history is not only found in books or beneath the ground. It lives in people, in custom, in memory, and through them the oracle still murmurs, not in thunder, but in whispers. The temple of the oracle at Siwa may no longer stand in its full glory, but its legacy endures in myth, in memory, and in the minds of those who seek meaning beyond what is written. For centuries, its voice guided kings and comforted pilgrims. Its silence today only deepens its mystique. Few places in the ancient world held such a profound air of sacred uncertainty, a space where questions are heavier than answers and silence could feel divine. Siwa's oracle lives on not in revived rituals, but in stories we continue to tell. Alexander the Great's visit remains one of history's most compelling crossroads, a mortal man surrounded by sand, seeking to confirm that he was more than human. Whether the oracle truly declared him a god or merely allowed him to believe it, the outcome was the same. Destiny was shaped. The enduring fascination with Siwa comes from this fusion of history and myth. It asks us timeless questions. Can men become gods? Can destiny be revealed? Does the voice of truth ever speak plainly or only in riddles? And perhaps most importantly, do we still listen for those whispers? Modern seekers visit the ruins not with questions of empire or conquest, but for clarity, for stillness, for presence. The desert remains vast and unmoved, the temple crumbling but magnetic. The same sun that scorched Alexander's caravan now warms curious travelers. The same silence that once surrounded the Holy of Holies still envelopes the broken walls. Siwa invites reflection, not because it gives answers, but because it has always honored the asking. The oracle, like all ancient voices, was never about fortune-telling. It was about direction, affirmation, possibility. The journey across the sands was never just a physical trial. It was a ritual of transformation. You didn't just arrive at the temple, you became someone else along the way. Today, as we face our own deserts of meaning, identity, and purpose, perhaps the oracle still has something to offer. Not a booming voice from the past, but a quiet suggestion in the mind. Who are you really? And were you becoming? The temple is dust. The voice is gone. But the question remains. And that, perhaps, was always the true prophecy.